The blood hit the emergency room floor before the triage nurse even finished calling the code. It came fast, arterial, dark, spreading across the linoleum in a shape that looked almost deliberate, like something being written in a language nobody wanted to read. Everyone in the ER froze. Doctors, residents, orderlies. They all hesitated for exactly the kind of moment that gets people killed. Everyone except one woman. She was already moving. 28 years old, 5'6", wearing green scrubs with a coffee stain near the left pocket. A nurse everyone at Hargrove County General had spent 2 years treating like furniture. She dropped to her knees beside the dying man before the crash cart even cleared the storage bay. And when the man's eyes found hers through the blood and the chaos and the overhead lights screaming above them both, he said 4 words in a voice barely above a whisper. "I knew you'd come." Her hands didn't stop working, but something behind her eyes went completely, dangerously still. If this story already has you gripped, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button, follow the channel so you never miss what comes next, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go. The emergency department at Hargrove County General Hospital had a specific rhythm on Thursday nights, and everyone who worked there long enough learned to read it the way sailors read weather. Slow between 6 and 8, a surge around 9 when the bars started filling up, another around midnight when bad decisions caught up with people. By 2 in the morning, things either went completely quiet or completely sideways, with nothing predictable in between. Nora Callahan had worked those rhythms for 2 years straight without a single night off that she hadn't fought for through 4 separate written requests to her shift supervisor. She knew the rhythm. She did not know that tonight it was going to break entirely. It was 11:47 when the ambulance bay doors blew open and the paramedics came in hot, one of them already calling out vitals in the clipped, airless cadence that meant they'd lost ground on the way over. Male, mid-40s, GSW to the right shoulder, exit wound compromised, BP is 80 over palp and dropping. Nora was at the nurse's station completing a medication log when she heard it. She closed the chart, capped her pen, looked up. The man on the gurney was enormous. Broad through the chest, military short hair gone gray at the temples, skin the color of old ash. He'd been shot at close range, and whoever had done it had known exactly where to put the bullet to make it hard to treat. The shoulder wound looked straightforward until you understood the angle, understood what vessels ran through that architecture of muscle and bone, understood why the paramedics' hands were still pressing down hard even after 7 minutes of transport. Most of the staff hesitated. That was the honest truth of it. Not cowardice, not negligence, just the half-second of recalibration that happens when something walks through the door that doesn't match the training scenarios. The attending on duty, Dr. Philip Orenstein, was already pulling back the gurney curtain and calling for a trauma kit, but his voice had that thin quality that meant he was working through the situation in real time rather than ahead of it. Nora was already moving before he finished the first sentence. She didn't run. Running in an ER was how you tripped over equipment and broke something expensive or someone fragile. She moved fast and direct, the way you move when you've stopped thinking about movement and just execute it. "Let me in," she said. Ornstein looked at her. He was 38, did his residency at Johns Hopkins, had a particular way of looking at nurses that communicated, without ever saying it directly, that he considered the hierarchy self-evident and non-negotiable. "Callahan, I need the crash cart, and the crash cart won't matter if you don't control the bleed first." She stepped past him, gloved up in one motion, and placed both hands into the wound with a compression technique that stopped 3 people nearby cold. One of the second-year residents, a kid named Marcus Foley, who was brilliant at diagnostics and terrified of blood, actually said it out loud. "What is that? That's not in any protocol I've ever seen." "It's not," Nora said, and she didn't look up because looking up was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. "Adjust the angle on that IV line. It's kinked at the elbow." Foley adjusted it without question. The man's blood pressure, which had been falling with the determined momentum of something that had already made up its mind, steadied, not recovered. Steadied. There was a difference, and the difference mattered more than anything else happening in the room at that exact moment. Orenstein watched her hands for approximately 4 seconds. Then he made the decision that good doctors make when something works and they don't understand why. He got out of the way and let it keep working. Get me a surgical consult right now, he said to Foley, and someone get a line of O-neg going. Nora held the compression and kept her breathing even and did not think about how she knew this technique or where she had learned it or the specific set of circumstances under which it had first become necessary for her to understand that a human shoulder contained enough vasculature to kill a grown man in under 4 minutes if you let it. She did not think about any of that. She thought about the pressure, the angle, the man's color, his breathing. He was still conscious. That was either a good sign or a terrible one, and she was reserving judgment. His eyes had been closed when they brought him in, but they opened now, and they found her face with an accuracy that felt deliberate rather than random, the way a person's eyes move when they're looking for something specific and have just found it. "Hey," she said quietly, "stay with me. Don't go anywhere." His mouth moved. She leaned closer because the room was loud with equipment and voices and someone's monitor going off in the next bay. He said, "I knew you'd come." Nora's hands didn't move. Her compression didn't shift by a millimeter, but something happened behind her eyes that she could not entirely control. A locking down, a going quiet, the way a room goes quiet after something falls from a significant height and everyone is waiting to hear whether it shattered. "Don't talk," she said. "You're losing blood." "Nora." He said her name. He said it like he'd said it before, like it was familiar in his mouth. She had never seen this man in her life. The surgical consult arrived 11 minutes later, and the man, who had no ID, no wallet, nothing in his pockets that would identify him to anyone, was taken up to the OR with a blood pressure that had stabilized enough to make surgery possible. Orenstein clapped Nora on the shoulder on his way past, which was the closest he'd come to acknowledging her existence in 2 years, and said, "Good catch, Callahan," in the tone of someone granting a favor. She pulled off her gloves. She stood there for a moment in the bay, the gurney gone, the linoleum still marked with the map of what had just happened. Marcus Foley appeared at her elbow. "Hey," he said, "that thing you did, with the compression. I've never seen that in any of our manuals." "I've seen it work before." "Where?" She looked at him. Foley was earnest in a way that hadn't been beaten out of him yet, and she didn't want to be the thing that started that process. "A long time ago," she said. "Somewhere else." She went back to the nurse's station and picked up her medication log and finished the entry she'd been working on, and she told herself the thing the man had said meant nothing, that dying people said inexplicable things all the time, that the brain under oxygen deprivation was capable of producing any number of strange outputs that bore no relationship to actual knowledge or actual memory. She told herself that. She had told herself a lot of things over 2 years. Outside the hospital, at 11:59, 2 black SUVs pulled into the parking structure on the east side of the building and did not move. Nora had come to Hargrove County General the way people come to places they never expected to stay. Sideways, through a sequence of decisions that each made sense individually and made very little sense collectively. She had a nursing degree from a state school in Montana, a license in good standing, and a 2-year employment record at Hargrove that was unremarkable in every department except patient outcomes, where it was quietly, inexplicably excellent. She had no military service listed anywhere in her file. She had requested that very specifically. The people she worked with knew her as reliable, competent, slightly remote. The kind of colleague you were glad to have in an emergency and never thought about otherwise. She ate lunch alone. She didn't attend the holiday parties. She remembered everyone's coffee order without being asked. And once, when a family was waiting on news about a code in Bay 4 and the waiting room had reached that particular pitch of barely contained panic, she had sat with them for 40 minutes and said almost nothing and somehow made it better. No one asked her much about her background. She didn't volunteer it. She had an apartment 12 minutes from the hospital that she kept clean and nearly empty. She ran at 5 in the morning, always the same route, always the same pace, a pace that was slightly faster than was strictly comfortable, the kind of pace that was not about fitness so much as maintenance of a certain discipline that she had decided 2 years ago she was not going to let go of entirely. She had not let it go. She just hadn't used it for anything. Until tonight. The black SUVs were still in the parking structure when she finished her shift at 2 a.m. She noticed them because she noticed things like that, vehicles that had been in a position too long, at an hour when that position served no obvious purpose. She noticed them and she filed them and she walked to her car with the same unhurried pace she used for everything. She was almost to the exit when her phone buzzed. Unknown number, local area code. She answered. Callahan. The voice was male, controlled, with the particular flatness of someone trained to deliver bad news without inflection. Don't get in your car. She stopped walking. Who is this? Someone who needs you to understand that the man you treated tonight is not who he appears to be, and neither are the people who followed him here. I'm going to need more than that. You treated a penetrating shoulder wound using a field compression technique that is classified at the Tier 1 level, Callahan. You want to tell me where a county ER nurse learned that? She looked at the parking structure, at the SUVs that hadn't moved. You've got about 30 seconds, the voice said, before the people in those vehicles decide whether you're an asset or a liability. I'd suggest going back inside. The call ended. Nora stood in the cold parking lot for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to run the math on what she'd just heard, what she'd been told, what she already knew, and had spent 2 years not knowing. And then she turned around and walked back through the ER entrance like she'd forgotten something. Inside, the night shift had settled into its post-surge quietude. Foley was writing notes at a workstation in the corner. A charge nurse named Sandra Tull, who had been at Hargrove for 17 years and had the institutional authority that comes with having outlasted 4 different department chiefs, was updating a board at the far end of the bay. The man from the OR, no name, no ID, had been taken to the 4th floor recovery suite after surgery, under the care of the surgical team, and was listed in serious but stable condition. Nora went to the break room, poured coffee she didn't want, and stood by the window that looked out over the east parking structure. The SUVs were still there. A third one had joined them. She was still standing there when Sandra appeared in the doorway. You're off the clock, Sandra said. It wasn't a reprimand. Sandra had never bothered with those. It was an observation. I know. The compression thing you did on the GSW. Sandra walked in and poured herself coffee, which she did actually want, and leaned against the counter with the posture of someone who had decided to have a conversation whether or not it was invited. Ornstein's been trying to figure it out for the last hour. He looked it up. Can't find it anywhere. It works, Nora said. I know it works. I watched it work. That's not what I'm asking. Nora looked at her. Sandra Tull was not easily unsettled. She had worked through a hospital shooting, 2 separate flu pandemics, and 1 incident involving a patient and a fire extinguisher that nobody who had been present ever fully described. She had a look she deployed when she suspected someone was not telling her something, and she was deploying it now. You want to tell me where you learned it? Sandra asked. Not particularly, Nora said. That's what I thought. Sandra drank her coffee. There are federal agents on the 4th floor. Nora went still. They got here about 20 minutes ago, 4 of them, badges I didn't recognize. Not FBI, something else. They're not letting anyone near the recovery suite. Sandra set down her mug. And about 10 minutes ago, I got a call from administration asking me to pull your personnel file. Did you? I'm telling you this, aren't I? They looked at each other. Go home, Callahan, Sandra said quietly. It was not the same thing she'd said before. This time it meant something different. It meant, whatever is about to happen, I don't know if I can protect you from it, and I'd rather you were somewhere else when it arrives. Nora thought about the parking structure, about the phone call, about the man who had known her name. I can't, she said. Sandra picked up her mug. Didn't think so. The 4th floor of Hargrove County General had a recovery wing that sat at the end of a long corridor lined with fluorescent lights that always flickered slightly at the junction near room 412, a maintenance issue that had been reported 11 times over 18 months and addressed 0 times. Nora knew the corridor. She'd floated up here twice during short staffing crunches and had delivered medication to this wing enough times to know the layout in the dark. There were indeed 4 agents at the end of the hall. They were not in uniform, dark civilian clothes, body language that announced law enforcement to anyone who knew how to read it. 2 were standing, 2 were seated. All 4 watched Nora the moment she stepped out of the elevator. She kept walking. Floors restricted, said the closer of the 2 standing agents. He was maybe 40, lean, with the particular patience of someone who had learned that physical presence was usually sufficient and rarely needed to be escalated. I'm on staff, Nora said. I treated this patient in the ER. I need to check on his status. Surgical team's handling it. I'm aware. I'd still like to check the chart. Ma'am, my name is Nora Callahan. She looked at him steadily. I've been working in this ER for 2 years without incident. The man in that room would have died on my emergency department floor if I hadn't made a specific decision to intervene in a specific way. I'm not asking to go in. I'm asking to see the chart. The agent looked at her for a moment. Really looked at her. The kind of assessing look that has nothing to do with charm or aggression and everything to do with rapidly recalculating risk. He stepped aside. The agent behind him, a woman, early 30s, dark hair cut short, said, "Let me see your badge." Nora handed it over. The woman looked at it, then she looked at Nora. Then she said something into a radio earpiece that Nora couldn't fully hear, and after 7 seconds of silence, she handed the badge back. "Chart's at the nurse's station," she said. "Don't go near the room." The chart told her almost nothing she didn't already know medically. Stable post-op. Transfused 3 units. A name had been filled in by the time the surgical team processed him, apparently sourced from some database the agents had accessed, because the name was not one anyone at Hargrove would have had access to on their own. The name on the chart was Thomas R. Vega. Nora read it twice. Her face did not change. She put the chart back and walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby and stood there watching the numbers count down. And somewhere between the 3rd floor and the 2nd floor, she made a decision that she had been trying not to make for 2 years. And once she made it, she felt something unlock in her chest that she hadn't fully realized had been locked. She knew that name. She knew exactly who Thomas Vega was, and she knew why someone had tried to kill him, and she knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with paranoia and everything to do with operational experience, that whoever had sent the shooter to that parking garage was not finished and was very likely already inside this building. The elevator doors opened. Standing in the lobby, looking directly at her, was a man in a hospital administrator's badge she had never seen before. He was holding a phone. He was looking at a photograph on that phone. He looked up at her, and she understood with the particular clarity that arrives in moments when the body catches up to what the mind has already processed, that the photograph on his phone was her. She did not run. Running was how you announced yourself. Running was how you turned a manageable situation into an unmanageable one. She walked left, through the corridor toward the cafeteria wing, unhurried, shoulders level, the kind of walk that belonged to someone who knew exactly where they were going and had no reason to explain it to anyone. She heard footsteps behind her, one set keeping a measured distance, and she calculated the hallway layout against the position of the stairwell, against the number of people likely to be in the cafeteria at this hour. 2 a.m. cafeteria. Skeleton crew. 1 or 2 staff, maybe a security guard on break. She pushed through the cafeteria doors. A food service worker was mopping the far end. A security guard, Dale, who she knew by name because she made it a point to know the security staff by name, was eating a sandwich at a table near the vending machines. "Dale," she said, "you talked to anyone about the federal situation upstairs?" Dale looked up. He was 52, 20 years on the job, ex-sheriff's deputy, the kind of person who stored information without necessarily doing anything with it. "Administration's been on the radio," he said. "Why?" "There's someone following me from the lobby. I need you to call this in." Dale put down his sandwich. The cafeteria doors opened. The man with the phone walked in, saw Dale, and stopped. He recalculated. Nora could see him do it. The micro-adjustment of someone who had planned for a private confrontation and was now doing arithmetic on a public one. "Miss Callahan," he said, "I just need to ask you a few questions." "Who do you work for?" Nora asked. "Hospital administration. That badge is from the 2022 template. We updated our badge system 8 months ago." She watched his face. "You want to try that again?" Dale had his radio out. The man looked at Dale, looked at Nora, and made the specific calculation that sometimes people make when they've determined that a situation has moved past what they were authorized to handle, and he turned around and walked back out through the cafeteria doors. Nora stood there. Dale said, "You want to tell me what just happened?" "I think someone is trying to reach a patient upstairs who shouldn't be reached," she said. Which was true, and was also the version of the truth that Dale could act on without requiring more context than she was prepared to provide at 2:15 in the morning. I'll call it up to the fourth floor detail, Dale said. Do that. She went back to the corridor and stood for a moment, working through the geometry of what she knew. Thomas Vega was upstairs post-surgery under guard. Someone, at minimum one person, had gotten inside the building using fabricated credentials. The parking structure still had 3 federal vehicles in it, which meant the agents upstairs were not the only team here. Whoever wanted Vega dead had sent one person through the front door and had possibly sent others through doors she hadn't identified yet. She thought about the phone call she'd received in the parking lot. Someone had warned her not to get in her car. That someone had information about her, about the compression technique, about her background, that was classified, which meant they either had clearance or had accessed something they weren't supposed to. Either way, she was in the middle of something that had started before tonight and was not going to end here. She went to the supply room on the first floor, not because she needed supplies, but because the supply room had a direct phone line to the facility management desk that was not routed through the hospital's main switchboard, and she needed to make a call without it being logged through the hospital's system. She picked up the phone. She dialed a number she had not dialed in 2 years, a number she had been so certain she would never dial again that she had not bothered to delete it, because deleting it would have required acknowledging it existed, and acknowledging it existed would have required acknowledging the world it belonged to. It rang twice. A voice she recognized answered on the third ring, and the voice said nothing, just waited, in the particular way of someone who has trained themselves to speak second. "It's Callahan," she said. "Vega's here. Someone already tried once. There's at least one agent inside with false credentials. I need to know who else knows he's in this building." Silence. Then, "How do you know it's Vega?" "Because I treated him in the ER 4 hours ago, and I read the surgical chart upstairs 20 minutes ago, and the name on the chart matched the last 3 letters of the operational designation from the Meridian file." Longer silence. "Callahan." The voice was careful now. Careful in the way of someone arriving at a conclusion they had been hoping to avoid. "You need to stay exactly where you are. Do not go up to the 4th floor. Do not go outside. Do not talk to anyone you haven't talked to already. You want to tell me why? Because the team that went after Vega tonight? Their secondary target was you." The supply room was very quiet. The fluorescent light above her buzzed at a frequency she'd never noticed before. "Why me?" she asked, though some part of her had already constructed the architecture of the answer and did not like the shape of it. "Because someone's been going through old Meridian files," the voice said, "and your name came up in a document that was supposed to have been purged 6 years ago. A document that says very clearly what you did and what you know, and why certain people would prefer both of those things stayed buried." She thought about the man in the parking lot, about the photograph on his phone. "How long have I been in the secondary target list?" she asked. "We don't know yet. We're trying to determine." The supply room door opened. Not Dale. Not a nurse she recognized. 2 people, moving fast, with the kind of coordinated entry that did not happen accidentally and had not happened because they were lost. Nora dropped the phone, and she stopped being a nurse. The first one came through the door fast and low, the way people move when they've done this before and aren't worried about being subtle anymore. Nora had exactly one advantage. She was already standing in the right position. The supply room was narrow, shelving on both sides, roughly 4 feet between them, which turned a 2-on-1 situation into something closer to a sequential problem rather than a simultaneous 1-1. Tight spaces have always been the great equalizer, and whoever had sent these 2 hadn't thought carefully enough about the geometry. The first man reached for her left arm. She let him close the distance. Then she redirected his momentum, not blocked it, redirected it, using the angle of his own forward weight, and his shoulder hit the metal shelving unit hard enough to knock a row of IV fluid bags onto the floor. He wasn't out, but he was down for the 3 seconds she needed. The second one was smarter. He stopped in the doorway instead of rushing in, which told her he had some training, and he took a fraction of a second to reassess. That fraction was enough. She picked up the IV stand that had fallen with the bags, aluminum, light, about 5 feet long, and put it across the doorway at chest height as he tried to enter. And when his forward momentum caught on it, she drove her elbow into the back of his neck in a way that was precise and targeted, and designed specifically not to cause permanent injury, because she needed him conscious and she needed him to eventually answer questions. He went down. The first man was getting back up. She was already through the door. The corridor outside the supply room was empty in the way that 2:30 in the morning corridors are always empty. Not because nothing was happening, but because whatever was happening somewhere else. She moved fast now, not running but close to it, back toward the main junction where the ER wing met the administrative corridor, because she needed people around her, and she needed the kind of witnesses that made certain categories of violence impractical. She passed a housekeeping cart. She passed the water fountain near the junction. She came around the corner and nearly collided with Dale, who was moving toward her from the opposite direction with his radio in one hand and an expression that said he had just been told something that had significantly upgraded the urgency of his evening. "Callahan," he said, "the feds upstairs are saying we've got a breach situation. They want everyone to—" "There are 2 people down in the supply room on C corridor," she said. "They need to be detained. Restrain them if you have to. Call it a security incident. Get the 4th floor team down there." Dale stared at her. "Callahan, what—" "Dale." She looked at him straight. "You've been doing this job for 20 years. You know when someone's telling you the truth. I'm telling you the truth right now. Get those 2 people detained before they get up." He had his radio to his mouth before she finished the sentence. She went back to the ER. Sandra Toll was still at the charge desk, because Sandra Toll was always at the charge desk, and she looked up when Nora came back through the bay doors with the expression of someone who had been tracking an approaching storm and was now watching it make landfall. "You've got a problem," Sandra said. It was not a question. "I need to know if anyone's accessed the patient's room upstairs in the last 30 minutes other than the federal team. Administration sent someone up about 40 minutes ago, said it was a records request." "What did he look like?" Sandra described the man from the cafeteria. Nora's jaw tightened. "He got to the 4th floor?" she asked. "I don't know. I assumed the federal team would have caught anything irregular." Sandra paused. "Should I not have assumed that?" "Call the 4th floor, right now. Ask them if that records request person actually showed ID to their team, or if he just got off the elevator and they assumed he was cleared." Sandra picked up the phone. Nora watched her face during the call. She watched it go from professional neutrality to a very controlled version of concern. The kind that experienced nurses develop. The face that keeps patients from panicking while the person behind it is running through worst-case scenarios at speed. Sandra put the phone down. "He went straight to the nurses' station," she said. "Pulled a records terminal. The team on the 4th floor thought he was cleared through the administrative system. He was there for about 12 minutes. "What was he accessing?" "Chart access log shows he pulled Vega's surgical notes, the post-op medications, and the nursing schedule for the next 18 hours. Nora thought about that. Medication schedule, nursing rounds. Anyone who wanted to know when a recovery patient would be alone and what drugs were currently in his system. That was what you pulled if you were planning a second attempt and wanted to time it to a window between nursing checks." "Who's on the 4th floor right now?" she asked. "Denise Ruiz. She's the night nurse up there. And call Denise. Tell her nobody goes near room. What's his room number?" 418. Tell her nobody goes near 418 without federal agent escort. No exceptions. Not dietary, not housekeeping, not doctors she doesn't personally recognize." Sandra was already dialing. Nora stood there and made herself breathe evenly and think, which was harder than it sounded when the floor beneath the situation was shifting this fast. What she knew. Thomas Vega was here, compromised in a recovery bed, with at least one group of actual federal agents guarding him, and at least one separate group that had gotten inside the building using false credentials. What she didn't know, whether those 2 groups were working for opposite sides, or whether they were entangled in some way she hadn't mapped yet. She didn't know how much time she had before whoever sent the 2 men in the supply room sent replacements. She didn't know how many people had access to the document that had put her name on a secondary target list. She knew the Meridian file. She knew what was in it, and she knew, with the exhausting certainty of someone who had spent 2 years trying to be ordinary, that the thing she'd buried wasn't going to stay buried now that someone had gone digging. Sandra finished the call and looked at her. "Denise has her door locked, and she's with the federal team," Sandra said. "But Callahan—" She stopped. "What?" "Administration's calling. The CEO's office. They want you in there in 10 minutes. The CEO of Hargrove County General was a man named Walter Drummond, who had come up through hospital finance rather than medicine, and had the particular relationship with clinical staff that tended to develop when someone spent their career reading budget reports instead of treating patients. He was not a bad person. He was a person for whom the metrics of patient outcomes existed primarily as line items that affected funding allocations, and who had spent 12 years building a hospital administration that reflected his priorities, which meant it was excellent at managing liability and mediocre at managing crises. He would not be calling her office at 2:30 in the morning because he was pleased with her. "Tell them I'll be there in 15, Nora said. Sandra relayed the message and hung up. Then, because Sandra Tull had 17 years of institutional knowledge and had been watching situations develop long enough to read their trajectories, she reached under the nurse's station and produced a small battered notebook and set it on the counter. "Whatever's about to happen in that office," Sandra said, "I've been here long enough to know that the first version of a story always gets told by whoever gets there first. So if you have anything you want documented before you walk in that door, write it down, I'll sign it as witness, and it goes in my personal files rather than the system." Nora looked at the notebook. Then she looked at Sandra. "You don't know what you're offering," Nora said. "I know exactly what I'm offering." Sandra pushed the notebook an inch closer. "I also know that whatever you did in that supply room 20 minutes ago, Dale is describing it to the federal team upstairs right now, and the words he's using are not the words of someone describing a nurse." The fluorescent lights hummed above them. Nora picked up the pen. Walter Drummond's office was on the second floor, which meant it was accessible from the main stairwell. And when Nora walked in at 2:43, she found him behind his desk with two other people she didn't recognize. A woman in a gray blazer who hadn't introduced herself, and a man who was clearly legal counsel, and who had the specific look of someone who'd been pulled out of bed and wasn't entirely over it yet. "Sit down, Ms. Callahan," Drummond said. She sat. "We've had a significant security incident tonight," he said, in the tone of someone who had decided that control of the narrative was more important than accuracy. "And in the course of addressing that incident, some questions have come up about your personnel file." "What kind of questions?" The woman in the gray blazer spoke for the first time. "Your employment application listed your prior work history as a home health aide in Missoula, Montana, and 2 years at a rural clinic in Billings. Is that correct?" "That's what it listed. And there's no military service in your background." "That's what it says." "Is it accurate?" Nora looked at her steadily. The woman had the posture and the cadence of someone from a federal oversight function. Not the same agency as the team upstairs, different body language, different energy. Someone administrative rather than operational. "My nursing license is valid," Nora said. "My clinical record at this hospital is clean. Every patient I have treated here has received appropriate care." "That's not what I asked." "I know." Drummond leaned forward. "Ms. Callahan, I need you to understand the position this hospital is in. We have a federal patient upstairs under armed guard. We've had 2 unauthorized individuals detained on our premises, and now my security chief is telling me that one of my nursing staff, you, neutralized those 2 individuals using techniques that are categorically outside the scope of civilian medical training." He spread his hands. "So I'm going to ask you directly. Is there something about your background that we need to know?" Nora looked at him. She thought about the 17 different ways she could answer that question, and she picked the only one that was both true and survivable in the short term. "Yes," she said, "and I'd like to talk to the federal agents upstairs before I say anything else." The woman in the gray blazer said, "That's being arranged." "Then I'll wait." Drummond's jaw moved. "You understand that we're going to need to place you on administrative suspension pending—" "I understand," Nora said. "Your badge and your access card. I'll surrender them when I know that patient upstairs is secure and not before." She said it quietly, without heat, the way you say something when you're not making a threat and not making a request, but simply stating a fact that doesn't have flexibility built into it. Drummond looked at the legal counsel, who looked at his notepad and said nothing. The gray blazer woman looked at Nora for a long moment, and Nora looked back at her, and something passed between them that was almost an acknowledgement, not of agreement, but of mutual recognition that they were operating at different levels of this situation, and both of them knew it. "The federal team will be down in 10 minutes, the woman said. "I'll be here," Nora said. "Dot." The agent who came down was not one of the four she'd seen in the hallway. He was older, mid-50s, gray at the temples, wearing civilian clothes that had been put on in a hurry and a look that said he'd been awake for a long time before tonight and was not particularly bothered by it. He introduced himself as Agent Kieran Marsh, which may or may not have been his real name, and he pulled a chair up across from Nora and sat in it with the unhurried posture of someone who had run enough of these conversations to know that rushing them was counterproductive. He looked at her for approximately 5 seconds without speaking. Then he said, "How do you know Thomas Vega?" "I don't," Nora said. "Or I didn't. Not personally. But you know the name." "I recognized it from the chart. The last 3 letters of his name correspond to an operational designation from a classified program I was part of several years ago." Marsh's expression didn't change. "Which program? If you have the clearance to know, you already know the name. If you don't, I'm not going to say it in this room." He studied her. "Meridian." She didn't confirm it. She didn't have to. "You were part of that unit," he said. "I was. For 4 years. I was medically attached to a Tier 1 combat rescue element. I left the program 6 years ago, and I've been a civilian nurse ever since. Your service record is not in any database we have access to." "I know." "Why?" "I didn't do it. When I separated, my record was supposed to be archived under the standard classified separation protocol. When I tried to access it 18 months ago for a background check on a second nursing position I applied for, it wasn't there. The position where it should have been was blank. Not redacted. Blank." Marsh was quiet. "Someone erased it," he said. "Someone erased it," she confirmed. He looked at her for another long moment, and she could see the recalibration happening behind his eyes. The shifting of a mental picture of who she was and what she represented from one category into another, and the recognition that the second category came with a considerably different set of implications. "The 2 men you put down in the supply room," he said, "describe their equipment." She did. She was thorough and specific, because thoroughness and specificity had been trained into her at a level that 2 years of civilian nursing hadn't touched. When she finished, Marsh was very still. "That equipment profile," he said carefully, "is consistent with a logistics network that we have been tracking in connection with the Meridian program for about 8 months. 8 months, she said. That's when Vega went off the grid." His eyes sharpened. "You know about that. I know Vega was running something inside the program before I left. I know he found something he wasn't supposed to find. And I know that the people he found it about had enough reach to make things like personnel records disappear." She held his gaze. "I left the program because I was told to leave. I was handed separation papers and told my service was complete, and I was encouraged to pursue civilian opportunities. At the time, I thought it was a drawdown. It wasn't, was it?" Marsh set down his pen. He said, "No, it wasn't." The room was quiet for a moment. Then from somewhere above them, from the 4th floor, came the sound of an alarm. Not a medical alarm, a security alarm, short and sharp, the kind the hospital used for unauthorized access events. Marsh was on his feet before it finished its first cycle. Nora was right behind him. Gong. The 4th floor corridor was chaos compressed into a narrow space. 2 of Marsh's team were at the far end near room 418, weapons out, and a hospital security officer was on the ground, not shot, not unconscious, but clearly shaken, holding his radio and trying to report something that was coming out in disconnected pieces. A crash cart had been knocked over near the nursing station and medical supplies were scattered across the linoleum. Denise Ruiz, the night nurse Sandra had called, was pressed against the wall outside 418 with the controlled expression of someone who had made the decision that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. "What happened?" Marsh said. One of his agents, a woman named Pierce, who had been one of the 4 in the corridor, said, "Someone came up the service elevator, east side. They had a uniform, dietary cart. We flagged it because dietary doesn't run at 3 a.m., but they moved before we could close the distance." "Where are they now?" "Inside 418. Doors locked from the inside. We don't know if Vega is—" Marsh looked at the door. Nora was already calculating. She looked at Denise. "Is there a connecting supply access to 418? Denise blinked. Then, "There's a linen access panel in the bathroom. Connects to the service corridor." "What's the layout of the room? Where's the bed relative to the window?" "Bed centered, windows to the left, Bathroom is directly across from the door, IV station's on the right. The IV station, Nora said. If they came in with a dietary cart, they're not going to shoot him. A gunshot in a hospital room at 3 a.m. brings every armed person in the building. They came to do something quiet. She looked at Marsh. They're going for the IV line. They want it to look like a post-surgical complication. Marsh processed this in about 1 second. How long does that take? Depends what they're using. If it's something fast, potassium chloride, air embolism, he has minutes. Can we breach? You breach that door, they go straight for the IV, and it's over. Then what do you suggest? She was already moving toward the nursing station. The linen access panel was in the bathroom. The bathroom of 418 connected to the service corridor via a standard maintenance pass-through that housekeeping used for cart access. The pass-through was approximately 18 inches wide, which was tight but manageable, and it opened into the bathroom at floor level, which meant anyone coming through it came in low. Nora pulled open the service corridor door at the far end of the hall. Marsh said, "Callahan's, give me 90 seconds," she said. "Then knock on the main door loud. Make noise. Give me something to work with." She didn't wait for his answer. The service corridor was dim and smelled like industrial cleaner and the particular stuffiness of a space that only exists for utility. She moved along it to the panel she knew corresponded with 418's bathroom, because she had memorized the floor layout on her 2 previous float shifts, the way she memorized every layout she worked in, because old habits from operational life had a way of persisting, regardless of what uniform you were wearing. She got to the panel. She could hear movement on the other side of the wall. Not from the bathroom, from the main room, the low shuffle of someone working with quiet concentration. She checked the panel latch. Manual. No lock on this side. She heard Marsh knock on the main door. 3 hard knocks, official and loud. Then his voice. "Federal agents, open the door." Movement in the room accelerated. Nora went through the panel. Whob. She came out low and fast in the bathroom, and she had about 1.5 seconds between clearing the panel and reaching the bathroom door. And she used them to confirm from the gap in the door that the person at the IV station was focused entirely on the interrupted task and not on the bathroom behind them. 1 person, not 2. A woman in a dietary uniform, mid-30s, moving quickly at the IV station with something in her left hand, a syringe, already loaded, reaching for the IV access port on Vega's line. Vega was awake. That surprised her. Post-surgical patients on his medication protocol shouldn't have been conscious, which meant either the chart she'd read was wrong or Vega had found a way to manage his sedation that the nursing staff didn't know about, neither of which she had time to analyze right now. He saw her come through the bathroom door. He didn't make a sound. She crossed the room in 4 steps. She got her forearm across the woman's wrist before the syringe reached the port, and the woman was fast. She dropped the syringe and went for Nora's eyes with her free hand, which was an effective technique against most opponents. Nora was not most opponents. She took the grab on her forearm instead, let the woman commit her weight forward, and put her into the floor with a controlled takedown that landed her face first on the linoleum with Nora's knee in her lower back and both her wrists secured. Vega, from the bed, said, "You're faster than you used to be." "Don't talk," Nora said. "You're in post-op recovery." "I've had worse." "I know. I've treated some of it." She looked up at the door, which had just been unlocked from the outside. Marsh had found another way in, or Denise had a key. And Marsh and Pierce came through with weapons up and took in the scene with the rapid comprehension of people trained to assess rather than react. Marsh looked at the woman on the floor. He looked at Nora. Then he looked at the syringe on the ground near the IV station. "Don't let anyone touch that," Nora said. "It needs to go to a lab." She stood up, still keeping pressure on the woman's wrists until Pierce came forward with restraints. She was going for the IV port. Whatever's in that syringe is what was going to look like a post-surgical complication on the chart. Pierce bagged the syringe without being asked. Marsh crouched down to look at the woman on the floor. She looked back at him with the particular blankness of someone who had been trained to say nothing, and she was going to do exactly that. He knew it. Nora knew it. Vega from the bed said, "Marsh, there's a secondary phone in the dietary cart. 3rd shelf under the thermal bag. She'll have already sent a status signal, but the outgoing number will still be in the buffer." Marsh looked at him. "You know her. I've seen her profile. She's not the principal. She's an asset for hire." He paused, and his face tightened with the involuntary expression of someone managing significant pain. The phone will give you more than she will. Marsh sent Pierce for the cart. The room settled into a controlled version of itself. The chaos resolved into procedure, people doing specific things with specific purposes, the way a crisis looks when it's been contained rather than resolved. Contained was not the same as over, but it was what they had for the moment. Nora stood near the door and checked her hands, which were steady, and felt the familiar distance from the immediate past that came when the operational part of her brain stood down and the rest of her caught up. There was always a gap between those two things. She had learned a long time ago not to examine it too closely. Vega was watching her. "You should be unconscious," she said. "I've been managing the sedation since about an hour post-op. I palmed the second dose." "That's not safe. I needed to be able to tell you something if they came back." He held her gaze. "Callahan, the Meridian file, the document that has both our names in it. I know about it. They're not after it because of what we did," he said. "They're after it because of what it proves about what happened afterward, what was done with the program, what was authorized at a level that—" He stopped, and this time it wasn't pain. It was the careful edit of someone who had learned to think about which walls were in a room before speaking. He looked at Marsh. Marsh said, "I have full authorization to hear whatever you need to say, Vega." "Then you need to hear this." Vega shifted in the bed and controlled the wince that came with it. 6 years ago, when Meridian was officially closed, it wasn't closed. It was redirected. The personnel were discharged or reassigned, but the operational network, the contractors, the logistics chain, the asset list, was absorbed into a private structure that has been running black operations for the last 6 years under cover of 4 different legitimate government contracts. Marsh was very still. "And the person running it," Vega continued, "is someone who, as of last fiscal year, sits on the committee that oversees funding appropriations for the same programs that Meridian officially replaced." He looked at Nora. "That's why your record was erased. Because your record directly links you to the original program, and the original program directly links to the redirection, and the redirection links to a man who cannot afford that link to exist." Nora thought about the 2 men in the supply room, about the woman on the floor, about the photograph on the phone in the lobby. "How long have I been exposed?" she asked. "Since the file review 8 months ago. Someone cross-referenced the original Meridian roster looking for personnel who might have retained operational knowledge. You were on that list." His voice was flat, precise, the voice of someone delivering information rather than a narrative. "I came here because I had a source who told me you were the only person with direct knowledge of the program's transition documentation who was still accessible. Everyone else is either inside the current structure, relocated internationally, or dead." The last word landed in the room quietly. Pierce came back from the cart with a phone and an evidence bag. Marsh took it without taking his eyes off Vega. "Who's the name?" he said. Vega looked at him, looked at Nora. Then he said a name that made the room go very, very quiet. Nora had heard the name before. Most people in the country had. The name belonged to a man who appeared regularly on morning news programs to discuss intelligence oversight and national security priorities, who had been photographed with 4 different presidents, who had a building at a federal intelligence campus named after him. Marsh sat down in the chair next to the bed, as though the information had taken something physical out of him. "You have documentation," he said. It was not quite a question. "I have the transition authorization document. Original signatures. It was supposed to have been destroyed in the program closure. It wasn't." Vega looked at the ceiling for a moment. "It's not in my possession. It's in a location I will give you when I know you have enough assets in place to actually do something about it, because the last time I gave this information to someone I trusted, I ended up in an ambulance." Marsh looked at Nora. She understood what the look meant. It meant, he'll talk to you. He's been trying to reach you. That's why he came here. She pulled the chair on the other side of the bed closer and sat down. "Tom," she said, which was the first time she'd used his first name, and it landed differently in the room than Agent Vega or Vega had. He looked at her. "Where is it?" she said. "Callahan, you came here because you knew I was here. You knew I'd treated the wound. You said so in the ER when you were barely conscious. You've been working toward this conversation for however long you've been on the run." She kept her voice level, not unkind, just direct. "So let's have it. What do you need from me?" He was quiet for a moment. There was something in his face that was harder to read than pain or calculation. Something older, something that had to do with the specific fatigue of carrying something alone for a long time. "There's a second person," he said. "A witness. Someone who was present at the transition authorization meeting. She doesn't know what she witnessed. She doesn't know what the document meant. She only knows what she saw and heard, but combined with the document, it's enough to put this in front of a grand jury without giving anyone in the current structure time to bury it again. Where is she? That's what I need your help to figure out. I had her location 3 weeks ago. 3 days ago, I got a signal that she'd been moved." He looked at Nora. "Whoever's been tracking me has been tracking her, and if they reach her before we do..." The monitor beside his bed went off. Not a critical alarm, a telemetry flag. His heart rate spiking, his blood pressure climbing. Nora stood up automatically. "We need to stop," she said. "You're pushing against a surgical recovery, and if you crash in this bed tonight, this conversation ends permanently." "Callahan, I know." She reached past him to adjust the monitor threshold, and in doing so, she leaned close enough that she could say the next part quietly, for him only. "I'll find her. Give me what you have." He looked at her. Then he said a name, just a name, 7 letters, nothing attached to it. No location, no context, no explanation. Nora filed it. She straightened up. Marsh was watching her from across the room with the expression of someone who had just realized the landscape of this situation was larger and more complicated than the map he'd walked in with. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Something in his face changed. "What?" Nora said. "Security footage from the parking structure." He turned the phone toward her. The image was grainy, timestamp in the corner reading 3:14 a.m. 2 of the 3 black SUVs in the parking structure were still there. The third was gone, and in its place, parked in the row behind, were 2 vehicles she didn't recognize, and walking between them, caught in the structural lighting for exactly 4 frames before disappearing out of range, was the man who had been in the lobby with the photograph on his phone. He was not alone. There were 6 people with him, and 2 of them were carrying equipment cases that Nora recognized from a very specific operational context, the kind of context that didn't involve asking questions and didn't involve leaving witnesses. And she looked at Marsh and said, "They're not here for Vega anymore." Marsh said, "What?" "He told them where I was." She looked at the door. "They're here to close the secondary target." The corridor outside the room went very quiet. Then every light on the 4th floor went out. The darkness came down all at once. Not the gradual dimming of a system fault, but the clean, total cut of a deliberate kill. The kind that takes out backup lighting simultaneously and means someone outside this building knew exactly which breakers to pull and in what sequence. Nora had 3 seconds of complete black before the emergency system kicked in and flooded the corridor in red. 3 seconds was enough. "Pierce," Marsh said, and Pierce was already at the door with her weapon up, scanning the red-lit corridor through the reinforced glass panel. "Clear so far," Pierce said, "but they'll be moving." Nora looked at Vega in the bed. The monitors had gone to battery backup. She could hear the change in the pitch of the equipment, the subtle drop in hum that meant they had maybe 40 minutes of reliable telemetry before the batteries started degrading. His heart rate was elevated. His blood pressure was climbing in the way that post-surgical patients' blood pressure climbs when adrenaline overrides the sedation protocol and the body starts doing things the surgical team specifically asked it not to do. "You need to stay still," she told him. "I understand that." "I mean it. Your sutures are 4 hours old. If you spike your pressure high enough..." "Callahan." He looked at her. "I've had this conversation with medics in worse situations than this. I know what my body is doing. Tell me what you need." She made a fast calculation. 6 people in the parking structure, a building that had just lost power. The 4th floor had 1 main stairwell access, 1 service elevator, disabled now with the power cut, and the fire escape on the east exterior wall. 6 people with equipment cases. Minimum 2 on the stairs, 2 covering the exterior, 2 mobile inside the building. They had maybe 4 minutes before the first team reached the 4th floor. "Marsh," she said, "how many people do you have in this building?" 4 on this floor, 2 in the lobby, 1 in the parking structure." "You're a parking structure person? Are they responding?" Marsh checked his radio. Static. He tried again. More static. "They're jamming communications," Pierce said from the door. "Of course they were. Kill the power. kill comms, move in the dark. It was not a complicated playbook, but it was an effective one, particularly against a target who was bedridden and a protective detail that had been sized for a recovery situation rather than an assault. "We need to move him," Nora said. Marsh looked at her. "He just came out of surgery." "I know that. Moving him is dangerous. Not moving him is worse. The room number is in the chart that the man downstairs accessed. They know exactly where he is." She was already at the IV stand, running the assessment she needed to run. Vega was on 2 drips. 1 antibiotic, 1 pain management. The antibiotic could be capped and restarted later without significant risk. The pain management was trickier because interrupting it abruptly in a post-surgical patient created a secondary problem, but it was a manageable secondary problem compared to what walked through that door if they stayed. She capped both lines with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this under considerably worse conditions. "Can he walk?" Marsh asked. "Not well. He shouldn't be upright at all, but we can move him in the bed if we—" She looked at the bed frame. Standard hospital bed, wheeled, locked. The corridor outside was narrow but navigable. "We go to the linen service corridor. It's the only access point they won't have prioritized because it's not on the standard floor plan." "You know this floor plan?" "I floated up here twice during short staffing, and I don't forget layouts." She unlocked the bed wheels. "Pierce, I need you to take point. Marsh, get the door." Neither of them questioned it. That registered somewhere in the back of her mind as significant, but she didn't have time to examine it. Denise Ruiz was still in the corridor, pressed against the wall in the red emergency light, and she looked at Nora with the specific expression of someone who has decided that whoever seems most competent in a crisis is the person they are going to follow. "Denise," Nora said, "is there anything in the linen corridor we can use to barricade the service elevator shaft access?" Denise thought. "There are 2 heavy linen carts, industrial ones, metal frames. Get there ahead of us and start moving them." Denise went. They moved Vega in the bed, which was not graceful. The bed frame caught on the doorway edge, and Marsh had to physically lift the corner clear while Pierce held position at the corridor junction, and Vega made a sound through his teeth when the movement jarred his shoulder that he immediately controlled and didn't repeat. The pain was real and significant, and he was managing it the way someone manages it when they've decided management is the only option, which Nora noted and filed and would address when there was time. The red emergency lighting made the corridor look like the interior of something that had already burned. They got the bed into the service corridor. Denise had moved one of the linen carts across the elevator shaft access. It wouldn't stop anyone determined, but it would slow them and make noise. Nora positioned the bed against the far wall, out of the direct sight line from either corridor entrance. Pierce took up position at the near entrance. Marsh kept trying his radio. Vega looked at the ceiling of the service corridor and breathed carefully and deliberately. The breath pattern of someone using discipline to manage what medication was no longer fully suppressing. "How bad?" Nora asked him quietly. "Manageable." "That's not a number." 6 out of 10, 7 if I move." She looked at his dressing. Clean. No bleed-through on the bandaging, which meant the sutures were holding despite the move, which was about the best she could reasonably hope for. His skin was too pale, and his pulse, when she checked it manually because she'd left the monitor in the room, was running faster than she wanted. "I need you to slow your breathing down," she said. "Deliberately. In for 4, out for 6. It won't fix the pain, but it'll keep your BP from climbing further." He looked at her. "I know you know how to do this," she said. He did it. Marsh finally got a partial signal on his radio. Degraded, intermittent, but enough to push a transmission. "All units 4th floor, we need backup now. We have a compromised power situation and confirmed hostile entry." Static ate the rest. He looked at Nora. "I don't know if that went through." From the main corridor on the other side of the door Pierce was watching came the unmistakable sound of a stairwell door opening. Then footsteps. More than 2 people, moving with the practiced quiet of people who were trying to be silent and were merely quieter than average. Pierce held up 3 fingers without turning around. 3 in the main corridor, which meant 3 more were somewhere else. "The fire escape," Nora said. Marsh turned. "What?" 6 people total. 3 in the main corridor, which means 3 more are on the exterior fire escape. This floor's fire escape connects to the east stairwell through the window at the end of the service corridor. She looked at the end of the corridor, where a single narrow window opened onto the exterior landing. That window. Marsh looked at the window. The latch moved. What happened in the next 40 seconds was not clean. It was not the kind of thing that got reconstructed accurately in after-action reports, because the people writing after-action reports had generally not been in the room and tended to impose a sequence and a logic that the actual event didn't have. What Nora knew in the moment, Pierce took the first person through the corridor door, and the takedown was controlled and fast and put that person on the ground, but the second and third were close behind, and the service corridor was narrow enough that two people engaging at the same time created a problem of angles. Marsh was at the window, which he'd physically braced shut with his weight, and the linen cart, and the people on the other side were applying pressure that wasn't going to hold indefinitely. Vega from the bed said, "Left side under the cart, there should be a—" Nora was already at the cart. Under the bottom shelf, wedged against the wall, a fire extinguisher. Not in its designated bracket. Someone had moved it and not returned it to the bracket, which was a maintenance violation that had just become tactically useful. She grabbed it. Carbon dioxide extinguisher, about 15 pounds. Discharge range approximately 8 feet. She didn't use it on the window. She looked at the main corridor entrance where Pierce was managing two people simultaneously and was doing well, but not indefinitely. And she discharged a 3-second burst into that corridor entrance that hit both individuals with a face full of CO2 at minus 78 degrees Celsius, which was not permanently damaging and was extremely temporarily incapacitating. And both of them stopped being a problem for Pierce for approximately 30 seconds, which was when the window gave. Marsh caught the first one through with a physical block that drove both of them into the opposite wall, and the second came through the window directly behind the first and had a weapon up. And Nora was already moving, already inside the weapon's effective arc, before it tracked to her. And what she did next was not something she could have explained in language that would have made sense to any civilian observer. It took 4 seconds. The second person was on the floor. The third hadn't come through yet. Nora went to the window. She looked out onto the fire escape landing, and the third person was there. A man, crouched on the landing, weapon aimed through the window. Except he wasn't firing, and the reason he wasn't firing was that between the moment the window had opened and this moment, something had changed outside. There were lights in the parking structure below. Blue and red lights, the kind that don't come from anything except law enforcement, and a lot of them. The man on the fire escape was looking down at those lights and making the same calculation that anyone makes when the situation they entered has changed more significantly than their mission briefing accounted for. He looked at Nora. She looked at him. He put the weapon down on the grating of the fire escape and put both hands up, and she understood, from his expression, that he had just made the decision that whatever he was being paid was not sufficient for the particular situation he was now in. Pierce appeared at the window beside her, breathing hard, and looked at the man on the fire escape. "Well," Pierce said. It was not a full sentence. It didn't need to be. The lights in the parking structure were from 3 county sheriff's vehicles and 1 unmarked federal car that had responded to Marsh's partial transmission, which had gone through in degraded form and been interpreted correctly by someone on the other end who understood that a compromised power situation plus a federal patient in recovery was not a call to respond too slowly. Power to the 4th floor came back on at 3:47 a.m., and the return of full lighting made the service corridor look considerably smaller and considerably more chaotic than the emergency red had. 5 individuals were in custody. The 6th, the man on the fire escape, surrendered to Pierce without further incident. All 6 were transported under armed escort, and Marsh spent 15 minutes on a secure phone line that he made very clear he was not going to share the details of. Nora sat on an overturned linen cart in the service corridor and did a systematic check of her own body, which was something she did after any physical engagement, because the specifics of adrenaline meant you didn't always feel injuries in the moment, and she had learned at considerable personal cost during her time in a classified combat medical unit that the things you didn't notice were the things that caused problems later. Left forearm, bruised, not broken. Right shoulder, strained, minor. A cut on her right hand she didn't remember acquiring, probably from the window frame, already clotting. Nothing that would impair function. She sat there and felt the adrenaline metabolize and replace itself with the specific exhaustion that comes after, and she looked at the wall opposite and thought about the name Vega had said, and what that name meant, and what came next. Vega himself was back on the monitors. Denise had reconnected him with the efficiency of someone whose professional identity was stronger than her fear, and his numbers were not good, but were not critical. The pain management drip was running again. His blood pressure was high, but tracking downward with the slow deliberateness of a body that had been pushed past its post-surgical tolerance and was being given permission to recover. He was awake. Marsh came and stood in the corridor doorway and looked at Nora. "The agency has been notified," he said. We're going to have significant resources here within the hour." "What kind of resources?" "The kind that should have been here 6 hours ago." He looked at the floor, which was the look of someone managing something that didn't have a clean outlet. "The man on the fire escape is already talking. They always talk faster when the situation collapses faster than they expected." "What's he saying?" "That the team was contracted through a logistics front company based in Virginia. That the contracting chain has 3 layers between the front company and whoever authorized the operation." He paused. "But the equipment they came in with, the cases in the parking structure." "What about them?" "Our people are going through them now. One of them contains a communications device that uses an encryption protocol that is currently only authorized for use within 2 federal programs." He looked at her. "Both of those programs report to the same oversight committee." Vega's voice came from inside the room. "Which committee?" Marsh walked to the doorway. "You know which one." "I need you to say it." "The Senate Permanent Select Subcommittee on Intelligence Asset Allocation." Marsh said it carefully, like something that had weight. "Which is chaired by—" "I know who chairs it," Vega said. "You must—" By 5 in the morning, the hospital had achieved the kind of controlled chaos that disaster situations eventually reach when enough institutional authority arrives to impose structure without resolving the underlying problem. Sheriff's deputies were on every entrance. 2 additional federal teams had arrived, one from an agency whose name Nora recognized, and one from an agency whose name she didn't, which was itself informative. The CEO's office, which had been the site of a conversation that felt like a very long time ago, was now occupied by a federal supervisor named Calloway, who spoke in the measured, declarative sentences of someone accustomed to being in charge of situations that had gotten away from other people. Nora had been brought to a conference room on the 3rd floor at 4:30 and asked to provide a full account, which she did, and the account took 40 minutes because she was thorough and because the 2 people across the table from her were thorough in their follow-up questions. And when it was done, one of them made a call that lasted 3 minutes and came back to the table and said, "We need to locate your personnel file." "It's been erased," Nora said. "We know. We're not looking in the standard archive." She looked at him. "Your unit had a secondary documentation protocol," he said. "Redundant physical records, held at a location outside the standard classification system. It was a program-specific requirement because of the operational sensitivity of the personnel involved." He set a folder on the table. "We've had access to that secondary archive for 6 months as part of a related investigation. Your file is there. Complete." She looked at the folder. She did not open it. The fact of it existing, the fact that the record of what she'd done and who she'd been was somewhere, intact, not gone, landed in her chest with a weight she hadn't expected. 2 years of the particular loneliness of being uncredentialed in her own history, of knowing what she'd done and having no way to prove it to anyone, of working in an ER where the most senior people treated her like a warm body in scrubs. 2 years of that compressed into the 3 seconds she sat looking at that folder. She put her hands flat on the table. "What do you need from me?" she said. "We need you to formally attest to the operational details you've described tonight. We need your account of the Meridian transition as you understood it at the time of your separation. And we need you to help us locate the secondary witness Vega mentioned." "He gave me a name." "We know. He gave us the same name. We're already running it." The man leaned forward. "Callahan, the person who authorized the erasure of your service record. We believe it's the same person who redirected the Meridian program. We believe there is sufficient documentation, combined with Vega's testimony and what we've recovered tonight, to move this forward. But this is going to go public. It's going to be significant, and your name is going to be part of it." She thought about the ER downstairs, about the coffee stain on the scrubs she'd been wearing when this started, about Orenstein saying "good catch" like it was a gift. "I know," she said. Sped. The morning shift arrived at 6 a.m. into a hospital that looked nothing like the one they'd left the previous evening. Federal vehicles had colonized the parking structure. Deputies flanked every entrance. The break room, where the overnight staff had gathered in the particular shell-shocked quiet of people who had spent a night at the edge of something they didn't fully understand, had taken on the atmosphere of a space where people were waiting to be told what to think. Sandra Toll was still there. She had not left. She was on her fourth cup of coffee, and she was writing in the battered notebook she'd put on the counter hours ago. And when Nora walked in, Sandra looked up and performed the rapid clinical assessment that experienced nurses perform on people without being asked, checking eyes and posture and color, and the specific quality of exhaustion that distinguishes functional from not. "Sit down," Sandra said. "I'm fine. You have a cut on your hand that needs proper closure, and you're holding your right shoulder in a way that says you're not entirely fine. So sit down." Nora sat down. Sandra cleaned and closed the hand cut with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this for 17 years and had opinions about adhesive closures versus sutures, and was going to apply those opinions whether or not you'd asked for them. "Your personnel file," Sandra said, not looking up from the hand. "They found it. They told you. The federal supervisor, Calloway, came down an hour ago. He's been talking to administration." Sandra smoothed the final edge of the closure strip. "Drummond has been in that meeting for 40 minutes, and he has not looked comfortable for any of them." Nora thought about Drummond, about his hands spread on the desk as he talked about the hospital's position, about the legal counsel's notepad. "What's he being told?" she asked. "I don't know the specifics, but whatever it is, 3 of the hospital board members have arrived in the last hour, before 7 a.m. Sandra looked at her. Board members don't drive in before 7 a.m. for minor situations. Outside the break room window, the parking lot was beginning to fill with the morning shift's cars threading between the federal vehicles. Nora watched a nurse she recognized from the day shift stop at the entrance, look at the deputies on the door, look at the federal cars, look at her phone, trying to decide whether to call someone or just go in. She went in. The morning was arriving whether the night was finished or not. Nora's phone, which she'd thought was dead because she'd thought it had been left at the nurse's station, was sitting on the break room table. Sandra had apparently retrieved it. There were 11 missed calls, 3 from numbers she recognized, 8 from numbers she didn't. There was also a text from a number that wasn't stored in her phone sent at 4:58 a.m., which read, "Second witness located, Denver. She's secure. Marsh has the address." She read it twice. She looked at the sender number for a long moment. Then she looked up and said, "I need to find Marsh." She found him in the third-floor conference room on the phone, and she waited in the doorway until he ended the call and looked at her. "The witness," she said. "In Denver. How long to get someone to her?" "We already have a team moving. Estimated arrival in about 90 minutes. "And you trust the team?" He looked at her. It was a fair question, given the night they'd had, and he knew it was a fair question. "These come from a different chain of command than anything connected to Meridian. I've been working with this team for 8 months. I trust them." She nodded. "There's something else," he said. He had his phone in his hand and he turned it toward her. It was a news alert, a wire service notification, time-stamped 6:41 a.m., which was 12 minutes ago. The headline was short and the content was thin, the kind of initial reporting that gets published when someone knows something happened but doesn't yet know what. Federal agents conduct overnight operation at Colorado Hospital. Multiple arrests reported. "It's out," she said. "The hospital parking lot has had federal vehicles in it since midnight. Someone was going to call it in." Marsh put the phone in his pocket. "Once our people get to the witness and secure her cooperation, we're going to move on the primary target." Nora heard what he didn't say. The primary target, the name Vega had said in the recovery room, was a man with considerable resources and considerable warning systems, and the kind of institutional relationships that had kept him invisible for 6 years. The window between the news alert and his legal team beginning to manage the situation was not wide. "How fast?" she asked. Hours, not days. The authorization came through at 6 a.m. He looked at her directly. "Your testimony is part of the package. You understand that?" "I do." "Once it moves, it doesn't stop, even if it gets complicated." "I know how these things work, Marsh." He almost smiled. "Yeah, I'm starting to understand that." Walter Drummond found her at 8:15 in the ER, where she had gone because she didn't know where else to go, and the ER was the place she understood best. She wasn't working. She was standing near the nurse's station, watching the morning shift run the routine rhythms of a Thursday morning. Nothing unusual, a sprained ankle in Bay 2, a hypertensive episode in Bay 4, the ordinary machinery of a hospital that had decided to keep functioning regardless of what had happened upstairs overnight. Drummond looked different than he had at 2:43 in the morning in his office. He had changed his shirt, but not his expression, and his expression had shifted from the controlled authority of someone managing a situation into something less comfortable, something that was aware of itself in a way that authorized authority usually isn't. "Miss Callahan," he said. "Mr. Drummond." He looked at the ER around them. He was a man who had spent his career in hospital administration and had the specific unfamiliarity with clinical spaces that develops in people who manage institutions without working in them, and being in the ER made him visibly uneasy in a way his office never did. "The board has been briefed," he said. "The federal team has provided us with a summary of the situation, including the secondary documentation of your service record." He paused. "I want you to know that the decision to suspend you last night, that decision was made on the basis of incomplete information, and Mr. Drummond?" she said. He stopped. "With respect," she said, and she was not unkind about it. "I've been in this hospital for 2 years. I've been a competent nurse for 2 years. The information available to you about my clinical performance didn't change last night. The only thing that changed was the category I got filed under." She looked at him steadily. "So I appreciate you saying this, but I'd rather you said it because the 2 years of patient care mattered, and not because the federal situation made it necessary." He stood there for a moment. Then he said, "You're right." And it sounded like he meant it, which surprised her slightly. Marcus Foley appeared from around the corner with a tablet in his hand, heading for Bay 4, and he stopped when he saw her and looked at her in the particular way of someone who had been assembling a picture from fragments for the last several hours, and had recently arrived at an image that did not resemble the one he'd started with. "Callahan," he said. "Foley, the compression technique." He said it like it was a sentence all by itself. "Combat medical application," she said. "Standard in certain units." He nodded slowly, then, "It worked." "It usually does." He looked like he wanted to ask about 17 more things and had the good sense to understand that the middle of the ER at 8 in the morning was not the time. He went to Bay 4. Drummond watched this exchange and then looked at the floor in the way of someone who was recalculating several things at once. Nora's phone buzzed. She looked at it. "Marsh. Team is with the witness. She's talking." She closed her eyes for 1 second. Just one. Then her radio. Sandra had returned it with the phone, crackled with the controlled urgency of someone who had learned to deliver bad news in a tone that didn't cause additional bad things. It was Pierce. "Callahan, 4th floor. Now." Drummond looked at her. She was already moving. Vega was awake. He was more than awake. He was sitting up in the bed with the specific forward energy of someone who had received information and was processing it at a speed that was not compatible with post-surgical recovery, and Denise Ruiz was at the monitor station with the expression of someone who had been telling a patient to stop doing something for the last 5 minutes without effect. Marsh was there, Pierce was there, and someone new was there. A woman in a dark jacket who had arrived in the last 20 minutes and who had the posture and the particular stillness of someone very senior, the kind of senior that doesn't announce itself. Nora didn't recognize her immediately. Then she did. Deputy Director Margaret Holst, Defense Intelligence Agency. She had seen Holst exactly once 6 years ago at a briefing at a location she was not going to name in a room she had been told she'd never attended, and Holst had been the most senior uniformed person in that room and had said, at the end of that briefing, that the work they were doing mattered and that it would be protected. Nora stood in the doorway. Holst looked at her. Staff Sergeant Callahan, the rank, her actual rank, the one attached to the actual service record that had been systematically removed from every database someone could access. Nora had not been called that in 6 years. She thought for a moment that she was going to have a reaction to it, the kind of reaction that comes when you have spent a long time being one thing and are suddenly called by the name of what you actually are. She controlled it, almost completely. "Deputy Director," she said, I've been briefed on the events of the last 8 hours. I've also reviewed the secondary archive file. Holst's voice was precise and unhurried. I owe you an explanation. Ma'am, let me give it anyway. She looked at Nora. When the Meridian program was officially closed, there was a determination made at a level above mine that certain personnel records needed to be withheld from the standard archive for operational security purposes. I was told this included yours. I was told it was temporary. She paused. It was not temporary, and the determination was made without my knowledge or authorization by someone who used my clearance level as cover. The room was very quiet. That person, Holst continued, has been under active investigation for 8 months. The evidence package that your testimony and Vega's documentation will complete is sufficient for federal prosecution. The warrant has been drafted. The timing of the execution depends on the interview with the secondary witness, which is ongoing. She looked from Nora to Vega and back. I am here because I want you both to understand directly from me that this will not be managed quietly. The individual responsible for what was done to the Meridian program, to its personnel, and to you specifically, that individual will face public accountability. Vega said, from the bed. How public? Congressional notification has already been initiated. The relevant committee chairs are being briefed this morning. She looked at him. He will not be able to contain this. Nora thought about the news alert on Marsh's phone, the wire service notification, the 12 minutes that had already passed since that headline went out. She thought about a man with considerable resources waking up this morning to find the walls moving. The witness, she said. Cooperating fully, Holst said. Vega exhaled. It was a long, slow exhale, the kind that has more in it than air. Denise Ruiz from the monitor station said, quietly and professionally, Mr. Vega, your blood pressure is starting to come down. Nobody laughed, but the tension in the room shifted slightly. Cracked at the edge, the way tension does when something has been decided and the deciding of it has released something that had been held too long. Nora stood there and looked at the window, which showed the gray early morning of Hargrove, Colorado, the parking lot below still occupied by federal vehicles, the sky, the particular pale color it gets before the sun gets fully organized. Her phone buzzed again. She looked at it. It was a text from Sandra. Turn on the TV, any TV, now. She looked at Marsh, who was already looking at his phone, and she watched his face when he read whatever was on the screen, and what she saw in his face was not relief and not satisfaction, but the specific, complicated expression of someone who has been working toward a moment for a long time and has just realized the moment has arrived ahead of schedule. He turned the phone toward her. The news alert was from a major national outlet, not a wire service. The headline was not thin. It had names in it, specific names, specific allegations, the kind of reporting that happens when someone inside an investigation decides the story is already moving and the choice is no longer whether it gets told, but who tells it first. The name in the headline was the name Vega had said in this room 6 hours ago. And below the headline, already in the article, sourced to a federal official who had spoken on condition of anonymity, were 3 words that Nora read twice to make sure she was reading them correctly. Arrest expected imminently. Holst's phone went off. She looked at it, and for the first time since she'd walked into this room, something in her face moved. Not quite relief, not quite satisfaction, something older and more complicated than either. It's time, she said, and she stepped out of the room to take the call. Nora stood in the room with Marsh and Pierce and Vega and Denise, and outside the window the morning was getting lighter by degrees. And somewhere in this building the ordinary work of a hospital was continuing because it always continued. Patients and nurses and residents, and the machinery of keeping people alive running on its own rhythm, regardless of what happened around it. Vega looked at her. How are you doing? He asked. Not tactically, not operationally, just asking. She thought about it honestly for a moment, which she didn't always let herself do. I don't know yet, she said. He nodded. Yeah. Her radio crackled. It was Dale, from security, and his voice had the quality of someone who was trying to sound neutral about something that was very far from neutral. Callahan, he said, you need to come down to the main entrance. Right now. She clicked the radio. What's happening? A pause. There are cameras, Dale said. A lot of them. And they're asking for you by name. The cameras were not a small thing. Nora had expected reporters, one or two, maybe a local affiliate with a handheld, the kind of coverage that a federal overnight operation at a county hospital usually generated before the story had enough shape to warrant the national desk sending anyone. What she found when she reached the main entrance lobby was something considerably larger than that, and the size of it told her more clearly than anything Holst had said upstairs how fast the story had moved in the last 40 minutes. There were 12 cameras that she could count from the interior side of the glass doors. 3 satellite trucks in the drop-off loop. Reporters clustered in the morning cold with the particular focused energy of people who have been told that something significant is happening here and are competing to be the one who explains it first. Deputies were holding the line at the entrance, which was the only reason the lobby wasn't already occupied. Dale was at the door and he turned when he heard her coming, and the look on his face was the look of someone who had understood this night was unusual but was only now fully processing the scale of unusual they were dealing with. "They started showing up about 20 minutes ago," he said. 2 trucks from Denver, 1 from Colorado Springs, and those national ones in the back came in the last 10 minutes. He paused. "They're saying a senator is being arrested." Nora looked through the glass at the cameras. "Where did they get my name?" she said. "I don't know. The first one who asked, guy from the Denver affiliate, said his source told him the nurse who started all of this was named Callahan and was still in the building." His source. Which meant someone had already started talking, and the talking had gotten specific enough to include her name. And that meant the shape of the story was already being formed outside this building by people she didn't know, using information she hadn't authorized anyone to share. That was how these things worked. She understood it. She didn't have to like it. Marsh appeared behind her. He looked at the trucks. Something moved across his face. Not surprised, not exactly, more like the expression of someone watching a timeline compress faster than the operational plan had accounted for. "This is going to complicate the next hour," he said. "Is the arrest happening this morning?" she asked. "The warrant was executed 22 minutes ago." He said it without fanfare, the way you say something that is significant and that you have been waiting to say for a long time and have therefore thought carefully about the saying of it. He was taken into federal custody at his home in McLean, Virginia, at approximately 8:47 a.m. Eastern. She did the math. 40 minutes ago, while Holst was stepping out to take the call upstairs, while Vega was watching the morning get lighter through the recovery room window. "Is it confirmed?" she asked. "DOJ put out a statement 12 minutes ago. That's why the trucks are here." He nodded toward the cameras. "This isn't going to stay a Colorado story." She understood what he was telling her, and what he was telling her had layers. The story going national meant the record going national, which meant the erasure going national, which meant the explanation for the erasure going national. It meant her name attached to a program that had been classified at a level that meant most of the people she'd worked with in the last 6 years had no framework for understanding it. It meant that the 2 years she'd spent being nobody in an ER in Colorado were about to become public context for a federal prosecution. She was not ready for that. She also understood, standing in the lobby of a hospital she'd worked in for 2 years, watching the camera operators adjust their lenses through the glass doors. That readiness was not the relevant variable. "Don't talk to them," Marsh said. "Not yet. Not until we have the full documentation processed and your record formally restored through official channels. If you say anything before that, you're a nurse with a story. After that, you're a credentialed federal witness with a verified service record." "I know the difference," she said. "I know you do." He paused. "Deputy Director Holst wants to speak with you again before you do anything public. Upstairs, 10 minutes. She looked at the cameras one more time. Then she turned and went back toward the elevator. And she did not look back at the glass doors because looking back was not going to change what was on the other side of them. The conference room on the 3rd floor had acquired 2 additional people since she'd last been in it. A DOJ attorney named Suarez, who had flown in overnight for reasons that now made complete sense, and a woman from the Inspector General's office who introduced herself as Brianne Taft, and who had the organized, data-forward energy of someone who had been building a case file for longer than anyone in this room had realized. Holst was at the head of the table. She waited until Nora sat down, and then she put a single document on the table and slid it across. It was a 1-page summary. Official letterhead, 3 federal seals, dated this morning. Nora read it. It was a formal restoration of her military service record. Not a reinstatement, because she had never been formally discharged in any way that required reinstatement, but a restoration. A declaration that the record of her service in the classified combat medical unit, including her rank, her operational designations, and her separation under honorable conditions, had been maintained in the secondary archive and was now being returned to the primary federal record system. At the bottom, there was a section titled Contributing Circumstances, which was a bureaucratic way of saying, here is why this happened, and the Contributing Circumstances section contained 2 paragraphs that named the individual, Senator Gerald Prentice, chair of the Senate Permanent Select Subcommittee on Intelligence Asset Allocation, and described, in the measured language of official documentation, the mechanism by which he had caused her record and the records of 4 other Meridian personnel to be removed from the primary archive, and the purpose that removal had served. The purpose was containment. The program had been redirected. The people who knew the original program had been systematically disconnected from any record that would allow them to credibly testify about it. No record, no standing. No standing, no testimony. No testimony, no accountability. It had worked for 6 years. She set the document back on the table. The 4 other personnel, she said. Their records are being restored as well? Yes, Holst said. All 4. 2 are currently being contacted by federal representatives. 1 is overseas and the process is slightly more complicated but underway. The 4th died 18 months ago. She said the last part without softening it, which Nora appreciated because softening it would have been worse. His family will receive notification. Nora thought about a person whose record had been erased while they were alive and had still been erased when they died. She thought about a family who had been told for 18 months that their person's service was unverifiable. She put that somewhere she would come back to. What happens to Prentice now? She said. Suarez, the DOJ attorney, spoke for the first time. He was methodical and specific in the way of people who communicate primarily through the structure of legal language, and had learned to translate that structure into plain speech without losing the precision. Senator Prentice has been taken into federal custody on charges including conspiracy to obstruct justice, misuse of classified information for personal protection, and directing the unauthorized alteration of federal personnel records. Additional charges related to the operational network, the contractors, the logistics chain, the assassination attempts, are being prepared and will be filed within 72 hours. Is he talking? His attorney has filed for an immediate bail hearing and has released a statement claiming the charges are politically motivated, Suarez paused, which is what attorneys do in this situation. But the documentation. The documentation is extensive, Ms. Callahan. The transition authorization document that Vega secured, the communications recovered from last night's equipment cases, the testimony of the secondary witness, your account, and the accounts of the 6 individuals taken into custody last night. The documentation is not a circumstantial case. It is a direct case with primary sources and physical evidence. Taft, from the IG's office, leaned forward. She had been quiet until now, making notes, and her leaning forward was the signal that she had something to add that was sufficiently important to interrupt her note-taking. There's also a financial trail that we have been building independently of the Vega investigation for the last 14 months. At the time we began building it, we didn't know it connected to Meridian. We were following contractor payments from 4 federal programs that appeared to be routing funds to a private logistics network. She looked at Nora. Your name appeared in a cross-reference 3 months ago, which is when we made contact with Vega's team. The financial trail and the operational evidence are 2 independent lines that intersect at the same point. Prentice, Taft confirmed. Holst looked at Nora. I want to be direct with you about something. Please. The next several days are going to be complicated for you personally. Your name will be public before this day is finished. The nature of the unit you served in, the operational details of the program, some of that will remain classified and we will work to protect it. But your name, your service, the fact of what was done to your record, that will be part of the public record of this case. She paused. You have the right to speak publicly. You also have the right not to. We are not going to ask you to perform for the cameras or to manage the narrative. What I'm asking is that you allow us to formally process the record restoration before you say anything on the record to media. How long? 2 hours. We can have the full restoration documented and verified within 2 hours. Nora sat there and thought about the cameras outside and the 12 missed calls on her phone and the news alert with the specific name in the headline. She thought about Sandra Toll's notebook on the nurse's station counter and the cut on her hand that Sandra had closed with adhesive strips while telling her that whoever got to tell the story first shaped it. She thought about Vega upstairs and the way he'd said, "I knew you'd come," in the ER, barely conscious, bleeding onto the linoleum. She thought about what it meant that 2 years of being nobody had ended at 11:47 on a Thursday night because she had dropped to her knees and put her hands into a wound without hesitating. 2 hours, she said. She went back to the ER, not because there was anything operationally necessary waiting for her there, but because the ER was the place she understood best, and she needed a place she understood while the 2 hours ran out. She stood at the nurse's station and looked at the board and looked at the bays and watched the morning shift move through its rhythms, and she thought about how strange it was that this room, which had been the entirety of her world for 2 years, was now a footnote to something much larger. Foley found her there again. He stood beside her for a moment without speaking, looking at the board the way residents do when they're working out what they want to say. "The news," he said finally. "Yeah. Senator Prentice, the program." He paused. Were you part of that?" "I was part of the original program, not what it became." He processed this. "The compression technique, the way you handled the situation upstairs, He stopped himself. "I'm not trying to pry." "You're not prying, you're trying to make the picture make sense." "Yeah." He looked at her. "It makes sense now. That's the thing. Retroactively, everything you've done here in 2 years makes sense in a completely different way than I understood it." She thought about what to say to that. There were several versions of it, ranging from the gracious to the honest, and she decided on something closer to the honest. "I was good at this job before you knew why," she said. That's the part that mattered. Foley looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone absorbing a correction that he hadn't expected to need. "Yeah," he said. "You're right." He went back to his bay. Sandra appeared from wherever Sandra always appeared from, because Sandra had an institutional omnipresence that Nora had long since stopped questioning. "How are you doing?" Sandra asked. "People keep asking me that." "People keep asking because the answer isn't obvious, and they don't know what else to say." Sandra leaned against the counter. "The board is meeting at noon, full emergency session. Drummond's been in there since 9. She looked at the ceiling briefly. "I've been at this hospital for 17 years, and I've never seen the board called for an emergency session before noon." "What are they deciding?" "I don't know officially, but unofficially, based on what I've pieced together from people walking in and out of that hallway, they're dealing with the liability from last night, the federal communications they received this morning, and the question of what the hospital's public statement is going to say about you." Nora looked at the board. A patient in Bay 3 was being discharged. Bay 6 had a new intake. "What do you think it's going to say?" she asked. Sandra was quiet for a moment. "I think it's going to say whatever is legally safest and institutionally favorable," she said, "which may or may not be the same as accurate. In my experience, those two things have overlapping but not identical Venn diagrams." Nora's phone buzzed. "Marsh, Prentice's attorney just held a press conference outside the McLean Federal Courthouse. Check any major feed." She pulled up the feed on her phone. The press conference was 2 minutes old. She watched it from the middle. The attorney, a man she didn't recognize but who had the particular practiced ease of someone who appeared in front of cameras professionally and in high-stakes situations, was speaking with the specific combination of controlled outrage and legal precision that defense attorneys deploy when they know the evidence is significant and they need to buy time in the court of public opinion while the legal process sorts itself out. He was calling the charges unprecedented. He was calling the arrest politically motivated. He was calling the individuals whose testimony formed part of the evidentiary package. He didn't name them, but the language made clear he was referring to Vega and to her, disgruntled former personnel with personal grievances. He used the word fabricated twice. Sandra, looking over her shoulder at the phone, said nothing for a moment. Then, "Is any of it true?" "None of it," Nora said. "Good." Sandra straightened up. "Then it won't matter in the end." "It matters right now," Nora said. Right now, it's on every screen and people are deciding what they think before the documentation is public. That's always how it goes, Sandra said. The lie gets 40 minutes of clear air before the truth shows up. Nora's phone buzzed again. Not Marsh this time. An unknown number, different from the one that had texted her at 4:58. She answered it. Silence for 2 seconds. Then a woman's voice, older, controlled, with a faint accent she couldn't place. Miss Callahan, my name is Renata Phelps. I'm a senior correspondent for a national outlet. I'd like to speak with you about the Meridian program and the events of last night, on your terms and at a time of your choosing. How did you get this number? I'd rather not say. I want to be transparent with you about what I know and what I'm going to report, regardless of whether you speak to me, because I think you deserve to know the shape of the story before it's public. Nora said nothing for a moment. I'm not available for the next 2 hours, she said. After that, call this number again. She hung up. Sandra raised an eyebrow. Don't ask, Nora said. But at 10:43, Marsh came to find her in the ER with Taft, from the IG's office, and a man she hadn't met before who introduced himself as Collins and who worked in federal records and who had a tablet that contained, he told her, the completed and verified restoration documentation. They went back to the conference room. Collins walked her through the document, which was considerably longer than the summary Holst had shown her, and which contained, among other things, the specific operational citations attached to her service record, the missions, the recoveries, the field work that had defined 4 years of her life and had then been made to not exist. She read the citations. She had read them before, years ago, when they were first compiled and the program was still active, and the assumption was that records were permanent. Reading them now, in the conference room of a county hospital in Hargrove, Colorado, with 2 federal officials watching her face with the careful attention of people who understand they are witnessing something private, was a different experience. She was thorough. She read every page. She noted 2 minor errors in dates, one transposed, one that listed a location code that was slightly off from what she remembered, and she flagged both because accuracy was accuracy and the document needed to be right. Collins corrected both on the spot. Marsh watched this and said nothing, but the expression on his face was the expression of someone filing information away. She signed the attestation at the bottom of the formal record. It was done. The record existed again. Her name was attached to what she had actually done, and the attachment was verified and documented and filed in a system that no individual, regardless of committee chair status or classified access, could simply blank out. Collins left to file the documentation. Marsh sat across from her. There's one more thing, he said. She waited. The 4 Meridian personnel whose records were also suppressed. One of them has been located and contacted this morning. He's a contractor currently working in private security in Arizona. He paused. He's been carrying his own version of the last 2 years. His contracting firm has been underbidding him for the same reason you've been overlooked at this hospital. His real credential base doesn't exist in any accessible system, so he's been operating on his civilian resume only. Is he going to testify? He's already agreed. He had a lot of things he wanted to say. Marsh looked at the table. It's 4 people, Callahan. 4 people who had the same thing done to them. You're the one who ended up in the position to do something about it. She thought about the supply room, about the fire escape, about a man bleeding on an ER floor who had said I knew you'd come and had meant something by it that she was still working out. I didn't plan for any of this, she said. I know. I was doing my job. I know that too. He looked at her. That's actually the part that matters most to the people building this case, because it means the chain of events is traceable to a completely organic origin point. No one can argue you came here looking for this. You were here for 2 years before it found you. She thought about Thursday night rhythms, about the ambulance bay doors, about the specific angle of a gunshot wound that most trauma nurses wouldn't have known how to address. The camera's outside, she said. Holst said 2 hours. It's been 2 hours. He nodded. What does she want me to say? She doesn't want you to say anything specific. She wants you to be yourself and be accurate. He paused. Though I'll add, and this is personal, not official, that whoever you've been in this building for the last 2 years is a better argument for what you actually are than anything you could narrate. She looked at him. That's an oddly human thing for a federal agent to say, she said. I have my moments, Potan. The lobby had filled somewhat since 8:15. A few more cameras, 2 additional print reporters who had come in from the cold to wait inside the glass doors with their press passes visible. A hospital communications officer named Greg, who Nora had never interacted with and who clearly had not expected to be managing a national media situation on a Thursday morning, and was managing it with the slightly overwhelmed efficiency of someone who had gotten in a car and was now driving it considerably faster than their license suggested they'd practiced. Pulse was in the lobby when Nora came down. So were 2 of the sheriff's deputies who had been there since the early morning. Drummond was there. He had come down from wherever the board meeting was happening, and he looked like a man who had been in a room full of difficult conversations for 3 hours and was not entirely through them yet. Holst looked at Nora. The documentation is filed and verified, she said. Your record is restored as of 10:51 this morning, fully acknowledged in the federal system. She said it quietly and directly. You can say whatever you want to say. Nora looked at the glass doors, at the cameras on the other side. Do you want me to make a statement on behalf of the agency first? Holst asked. No, Nora said. I'll go out. She went to the glass doors. A deputy opened them. The cold hit her first. It was just past 11, and Hargrove in late fall ran cold in the mornings, even when the afternoons were bearable. And then the cameras swiveled toward her with the coordinated attention of a group of instruments pointed at the same subject, and the reporters shifted forward with the collective kinetic energy of people who have been waiting for something and are now tracking its arrival. She stood on the entrance steps and looked at the cameras and did not prepare an expression, because prepared expressions were something she had never been good at and was not going to start now. My name is Nora Callahan, she said. I'm a nurse at Hargrove County General Hospital. I've worked here for 2 years. Last night, a patient was brought into the emergency department with a serious gunshot wound. I treated him. That was my job. What happened after that was... She paused. Not for effect, because she was working out, in real time, the most accurate word. It was a consequence of things that started a long time ago and that I didn't choose. I can't speak to the ongoing legal process. What I can tell you is that there are people who served this country in classified roles whose records were removed from the federal system to protect a man who is now in federal custody. That is wrong. It was wrong when it was done, and it is wrong now. The record has been restored. All of it. She looked at the cameras. That's what I have to say. The reporter started talking at once. She answered 3 questions. Specific ones, factual ones, the ones that let her say true things without speculating about things she had been asked not to speak to publicly. And she did not answer the 4th one because it was asking her to characterize Senator Prentice's guilt in a way that was not her role to characterize. And she said so directly, and then she went back inside. The lobby was quiet when the doors closed behind her. Drummond was standing near the reception desk, and he looked at her with the particular expression of a man who was in the process of significantly revising something he had believed. Ms. Callahan, he said. She waited. The board met this morning. He stopped and started again, which was not something she'd seen him do before. They've formally rescinded the suspension, and they've asked me to convey that the hospital's position is that your clinical record here is excellent, and that the events of last night demonstrated a standard of care and judgment that this hospital is grateful for. She looked at him. That came from the board, he said, not just from me. I appreciate that, she said. And she did appreciate it in the complicated way you appreciate things that are correct but overdue. For what it's worth, he said, the 2 years mattered. The clinical record mattered. I should have... He stopped. I looked at the outcomes, the actual patient outcomes, over 2 years. I looked at them this morning. Someone put a spreadsheet together for the board package. He looked at his hands for a moment. You were the highest performing nurse on this floor by 3 separate metrics. I didn't know that. You didn't look, she said. It was not an accusation. It was just true. No, he said. I didn't look. She left him standing there. By 1 in the afternoon, the televisions in the hospital waiting room, 3 of them, mounted at angles that served the maximum number of chairs, were running the story continuously. Nora saw fragments of it as she moved through the building, the security footage from the McLean Federal Courthouse, Prentice in the back seat of a black car, visible briefly through a window, his face in the profile that cameras always catch at the specific moment people are hoping they won't be caught. His attorney's statement, which had already cycled several times and was being contextualized now by legal analysts in split-screen segments. A senator from the Oversight Committee speaking from a lectern in a building she recognized. Then her own face, on a screen in the third-floor corridor, standing on the steps of this hospital in the cold, saying, "My name is Nora Callahan," to a group of cameras. She stopped walking when she saw it. It was a strange experience, seeing yourself as a thing that was being broadcast, understanding that the image had separated from you and was now doing work in the world independent of whatever you were actually doing at the moment it was being shown. She looked at herself on the screen and felt the distance between that version and this one. The one standing in a hospital corridor with a closed cut on her hand and a strained shoulder, and 2 years of accumulated ordinary exhaustion under the specific exhaustion of last night. Pierce was walking toward her from the far end of the corridor, and she slowed when she saw Nora stopped in front of the television. "How are you holding up?" Pierce asked. "Why does everyone ask me that?" Nora said. "Because everyone's worried about you and doesn't know how to say it directly." "I'm functional," Nora said. "That's not the same thing." "No," Nora agreed, "it's not." They stood there for a moment watching the coverage, and the coverage cut to a correspondent outside the McLean Federal Building who was explaining the charge sheet in the simplified language of broadcast news. And Nora listened to the simplified version of something she had lived through in its complicated version and thought about the distance between those two things. "Vega," she said. "How is he?" "Stable. Orenstein came up to check on him this morning." Which is interesting, given that Orenstein wasn't the one who did the surgery, but apparently he had opinions about the suture work. Pierce's tone was dry. "Vega is going to be here for at least 5 days, possibly longer." "And after that?" "Protective custody until the trial proceedings begin, which, based on the timeline Suarez outlined, is going to be a while." Nora thought about Vega in the bed, about the 7-letter name he'd said quietly, like he'd been carrying it for a long time, and the weight of saying it aloud had been its own kind of relief. She thought about the second witness in Denver and what she had seen and what that combined with the documentation would mean in a courtroom. She thought about the 4 other Meridian personnel and the man in Arizona with his real credential base buried in his civilian resume doing inadequate work on his behalf. Her phone rang. The national correspondent. Renata Phelps. Nora answered it. "I watched your statement outside," Phelps said. "I'd like to give you the opportunity to go further. Not today. I understand the legal constraints. But when you're ready, I'd like to tell the full story of what the Meridian program was and what was done to the people who served in it." "Why?" Nora said. "Because the charge sheet and the trial will tell the legal story. Somebody needs to tell the human one." Nora stood in the corridor and looked at her own face on the television screen, which had cycled back around to the clip of her on the entrance steps, and she thought about a family somewhere who had received notification this morning that their person's erased service record was being restored, 18 months too late for that person to know. "Not today," she said, "but when I'm ready." "I'll wait," Phelps said. "This story isn't going anywhere fast." She ended the call. Down the corridor, the elevator opened and Sandra Tull stepped out with the battered notebook under her arm and the expression of someone who had information and had decided this was the moment to deliver it. "What?" Nora said. "Board meeting just ended," Sandra said. "Official resolution passed, 4-1. She stopped in front of Nora. "They voted to name the trauma suite renovation after you, the one they've been funding for the last 8 months. She paused. "Drummond voted against it, for the record. Said it was premature." Nora looked at her. "I know," Sandra said. "It's a lot. It's—" Nora started, then stopped. Then, "They've known me for 2 years. They don't name things after people they actually know. They name them after donors." "You're about to be a very famous person in a fairly specific way," Sandra said. "They're getting ahead of it." Nora looked at the ceiling briefly. "That's not why I want recognition." "No," Sandra said, "but it's what institutions do when they're embarrassed. They perform gratitude publicly because they can't perform it retroactively." She tucked the notebook under her other arm. "The ones that matter will know the difference." Down at the end of the corridor, Nora's radio crackled. It was Marsh. His voice was tight in a way it hadn't been since the early morning. "Callahan, conference room, now." She looked at Sandra. Go, Sandra said. She went. Marsh was in the conference room with Holst and Taft and Suarez, and all four of them had the specific quality of controlled urgency that happens when something new has arrived and hasn't been fully processed yet. On the table was a physical document, printed, not on a tablet, physical paper, which meant it had come in through a secure fax line or courier, which meant it was either very official or very sensitive, or both. Holst looked at her when she came in. Prentice's attorney, Holst said, filed an emergency motion with the federal court 40 minutes ago. For bail, Nora said. No, for dismissal. Holst's voice was precise. On the grounds that the primary documentation, the Meridian Transition Authorization document that Vega secured, was obtained through methods that the attorney is arguing constitute unauthorized access to federal classified materials. He's filing to have the document excluded. Suarez said, It's a standard defense motion. It has a low probability of success given... That's not the part I'm bringing you here for, Holst said. She looked at Nora. The motion includes a supporting declaration. From a source the attorney is claiming has first-hand knowledge of how Vega obtained the document. She slid the physical paper across the table. Nora looked at it. The supporting declaration was signed. The name on the signature line was someone she knew. Not from Meridian, not from last night. From her 2 years at this hospital, from the ordinary rhythms of a Thursday night ER shift, from the kind of acquaintance you build with someone you see regularly without ever fully trusting. The signature belonged to someone who had been inside this hospital last night. Someone who had heard things they shouldn't have heard. Someone who, as of 40 minutes ago, had decided that the right move was to provide a sworn declaration in support of a man who had spent 6 years running a criminal network that had tried to kill 2 people in this building. Nora read the declaration. Then she looked up at Holst. This person was in the supply room corridor, she said, when I went back inside after the parking lot. We know, Holst said. They heard the phone call, or part of it. We believe so. And they've been sitting on this all morning. Until 40 minutes ago, yes. Holst looked at her. Which means the attorney's office has had this for longer than 40 minutes. Which means it was communicated to Prentice's team prior to or at the time of his arrest. She paused. Which means there is a channel between someone in this hospital and Prentice's network that we did not identify last night. The conference room was very quiet. Nora looked at the signature. She thought about the overnight, about the people she'd spoken to, the places she'd been, the fragments of conversation that had happened in corridors and break rooms and the 4th-floor service passage. She thought about how a building works, who moves through it, who hears things in passing, who has access to spaces that seem peripheral and aren't. She thought about the man in the lobby with the photograph on his phone. He had been looking for her. He had known what she looked like. Someone had given him that photograph. Someone who had access to the hospital's internal staff directory and the specific subdirectory that contained security badge photos, administrative access. She looked at the signature again. This doesn't sink the case, Suarez said. The motion has... It's not meant to sink the case, Nora said. It's meant to slow it down, create enough procedural delay for something else to happen. She looked at Holst. Prentice's network is still operational. Last night's arrests were one team. There are other teams. Holst said, We're aware. The secondary witness in Denver. Is she still secure? As of 30 minutes ago, yes. As of 30 minutes ago, Nora said. The room went quiet again with a different quality. The quality of people who are very good at their jobs processing the possibility that 30 minutes was not the same as right now. Holst picked up her phone. Holst had the phone to her ear before Nora finished the sentence, and the call connected on the second ring, and whatever the person on the other end said made Holst's jaw tighten in a way that answered the question before she said anything out loud. Get eyes on her right now, Holst said. Don't move her yet, just confirm visual. She waited. The conference room was the specific kind of quiet that happens when 4 people who are good at managing uncertainty are all managing it simultaneously and not talking about it. Holst said, Confirmed? And then, Don't let anyone within 50 feet of that location who wasn't there 20 minutes ago. She ended the call. She's still secure. The team has visual. The air in the room changed. Not relief exactly, but the release of a pressure that had been building for the 30 seconds between Nora's question and the confirmation. The declaration, Nora said. The person who signed it. Where are they now? Marsh looked at Taft. Taft said, "We have a name from the signature. We're running it against hospital employee records now." "I can tell you who it is faster than the records can," Nora said. All four of them looked at her. "The administrative assistant in the records department. 3rd floor, east side. She's been here about 14 months. Her name is Paula Whitmore." Nora looked at the signature on the declaration again. "The handwriting matches. I've seen her signature on interdepartment memos." Marsh was already on his radio. Taft was pulling up the employee database. Nora sat back and thought about the topology of it. How someone gets placed inside a hospital 14 months before they're needed. How a network that has been operational for 6 years builds redundancy into every system it touches. How the man who had needed a photograph of her badge photo had known exactly who to call inside this building to get it. Administrative access. Records department. Someone who moved through institutional infrastructure invisibly because that was the design. It was sophisticated and it was patient and it had very nearly worked. Marsh came back from the radio. "Security has her location. She's at her desk." "Don't spook her," Holst said. "If she signals out before we get to her, we lose whatever communications trail she has on that device." "I know." He looked at Nora. "How certain are you?" "Certain enough to stake this morning's record restoration on it," she said. "But I could be wrong." "That's the most honest thing anyone has said in this room all day," Taft said, and pulled up the employee record on her tablet and turned it toward Nora. Paula Whitmore. Hired 14 months ago. Prior employment. A healthcare administration firm based in Northern Virginia. Northern Virginia. Same state as the logistics front company. Same general corridor as McLean. It wasn't proof. It was a data point, and data points needed other data points before they became conclusions. But Nora watched Holst's face as Holst read the same information and saw the same confirmation in Holst's expression that she felt in her own chest. "Get her," Holst said to Marsh. They got her quietly, which was the only way to do it that preserved the communications device. 2 deputies and Pierce walked into the records department at 11:58 and told Paula Whitmore there were questions related to last night's incident that required her participation. And Paula Whitmore, who was either very good at performance or genuinely believed she was protected, went with them without objection and without reaching for anything on her desk or her phone. The phone on her desk was bagged by Taft before anyone else touched it. Nora was not in the room when they brought Whitmore in for questioning. She was in the corridor outside, and she watched through the reinforced glass panel as Marsh sat across from a woman who had been positioned in this hospital for 14 months with a specific purpose and who was now calculating, visibly, how much that positioning was going to cost her. Whitmore was not what Nora had expected, which was its own lesson. She was 43, ordinary-looking in every measurable sense, the kind of person who could sit in a break room for a year and a half and be remembered by almost no one. Which was the point. Which was always the point with people placed in positions like this. She lawyered up inside 4 minutes, which was faster than most people managed it, which confirmed the calculation rather than undermining it. The phone, however, did not lawyer up. Taft worked on it with the focused, unsentimental efficiency of someone who had done this before, and within 30 minutes she had a partial communication log that showed 8 outgoing contacts over the last 14 hours to a number that Suarez, looking over her shoulder, identified as a number associated with a communications relay service used by Prentice's legal team. 8 contacts. Starting at 11:53 the previous evening, approximately 6 minutes after Nora had been brought into the hospital by the first phone call in the parking lot. Someone had been reporting the situation from inside this building in near real time for the entirety of the night, and the people receiving those reports had used the information to sequence every action that followed. The assault team in the parking structure, the timing of the power cut, the emergency motion filed with the federal court. It was not a spontaneous response to a crisis. It was a managed operation that had been activated the moment Thomas Vega arrived in the ER. Suarez looked at Holst. "This changes the motion," he said. "The declaration was obtained through a coordinated effort to obstruct the investigation, using a planted employee. That's not a defense filing. That's additional evidence of conspiracy." "File the response," Holst said. "Today." By 2 in the afternoon, the things that had been moving since before dawn began arriving at their destinations. The federal court received Suarez's response to the dismissal motion at 2:12. including the communication log from Whitmore's phone and the employment history connecting her prior firm to Northern Virginia. The motion for dismissal was denied at 2:47. The judge's order was 12 words. Motion denied. Evidence obtained legally. Preliminary hearing proceeds as scheduled. Nora heard about it from Marsh, who appeared in the ER where she had gone again. Not because she could work, but because standing still had become difficult, and moving through a familiar space was the closest thing to rest she was capable of right now. And who told her in the straightforward way he'd adopted for delivering information, without preamble, and without the layering of significance that some people added when they thought news needed to be felt rather than heard. "It's going forward," he said. She nodded. "Whitmore is being transferred to federal custody this afternoon. The charge is coordinated obstruction and conspiracy, which carries considerably more weight than just signing a declaration." He paused. Prentice's attorney released a second statement about 20 minutes ago. What did it say? That the senator maintains his innocence and that the filing of additional charges against an uninvolved party represents government overreach. He looked at her. It said the same things with more words. "How's the network coverage?" "Significant. The denial of the motion is running on every major outlet. The employment connection to Whitmore's prior firm is already being picked up by the financial press, which tends to follow the money faster than the general desks." He paused again. "Vega wants to see you." She went upstairs. The fourth-floor recovery wing looked nothing like it had at 3 a.m. The red emergency lighting was gone. The service corridor was empty, the linen carts back in their positions, the only evidence of the night's events, a faint scuff mark on the wall near the window that the janitorial staff hadn't gotten to yet. Denise Ruiz was at the nurse's station, and she looked up when Nora came off the elevator and gave her the particular look of a nurse who has decided to be the last person to make any situation more complicated than it already is. "He's been awake for 3 hours, Denise said. "I've asked him twice to rest. He informs me that he's resting." "What is he actually doing?" "He has a federal-issue tablet. I don't know what's on it, and I've decided not to ask." Nora went into 418. Vega was indeed not resting in any conventional sense. He was propped at an angle that was probably the maximum his sutures could tolerate without Denise staging another intervention. Reading something on the tablet with the concentrated expression of a person who has been waiting for information to arrive and is now processing a great deal of it very fast. He looked up when she came in. "The motion," he said. "Denied," she said. 2:47. Something moved through his face. Not relief so much as the release of a specific tension that had been present since she'd first seen him in the ER. The tension of a man who had been running for 8 months and was not yet fully convinced the running was over. "Whitmore," he said. "You knew about her?" "I suspected there was someone inside the building. I didn't know who. The speed of the response last night, the power cut, the team in the parking structure, the motion this morning. That's not reactive planning. That's standing protocol." He set the tablet down. "Prentice has been running this kind of thing for 6 years. You don't do that without building infrastructure into the systems you're most worried about." "He was worried about this hospital specifically?" "He was worried about me reaching you specifically. The hospital was the vector." He looked at the window. "I've been moving for 8 months trying to get to a position where I could hand off what I had to someone who could actually do something with it. Every time I got close, the operation around me collapsed. People I trusted turned out to be inside the network. Safe houses that weren't. I ended up in Hargrove because it was the last name on a list I'd built of people from the original program who were still accessible and hadn't been reached by the network." He paused. "You were the last one." She sat in the chair beside the bed. "Why me last?" she said. "Because you were the hardest to approach without flagging. You went so far off the grid, different state, civilian job, no contact with anyone from the program, that the network's monitoring system had you flagged as low priority, which meant I could get close without triggering the same response I'd triggered everywhere else." He looked at her. Getting shot in the process was not the plan. "What was the plan?" "Find you. Establish contact through a controlled channel. Give you the name and the location of the documentation and let you make the decision about what to do with it." He looked at the cut on her hand. "It went differently." "Yeah," she said. "You handled it." "We handled it," she said. "There's a difference." He nodded. He looked tired in the deep way of someone who has been running on purpose and adrenaline for a sustained period, and is now experiencing the full cost of that, the way your body presents the bill once it believes the emergency is over. The documentation, she said. Holmes said it's part of the evidentiary package. It is. The original document was transferred to DOJ custody this morning through the safe channel we had in place. He paused. 8 months of carrying that thing. I kept it in 3 different locations at different times, which is why Prentice's people could never pin down exactly where it was. They knew I had it. They didn't know where. He looked at the ceiling. An original signature document with the authorization chain for the Meridian redirection, signed by people who are still in federal service, still drawing federal paychecks. That's not circumstantial. That's the thing itself. It's enough. It's more than enough, he said. They sat in quiet for a moment. The other 3, she said, from the program, the ones still living. All in contact with federal investigators now. The man in Arizona, his name is Ray Bodkin, you might remember him. I remember him. He agreed to cooperate inside an hour of being contacted. He's been carrying 2 years of the same thing you've been carrying. Bad professional opportunities because his credential base doesn't exist. Knowing what he's capable of and not being able to demonstrate it to anyone who matters. Vega's jaw tightened. Prentice didn't just erase our records, he erased our leverage. He made it so that even if we said what we knew, no one would have any reason to believe us over a senator with 40 years of institutional standing. Ian, he miscalculated, Nora said. He miscalculated you, Vega said. Specifically, you were supposed to be isolated. You'd gone so far civilian that his system flagged you as contained. He didn't account for the fact that contained and neutralized aren't the same thing. He looked at her. You walked into that ER, and you did your job, and the job you did happened to be the exact thing that opened every door he'd spent 6 years keeping shut. She thought about 11:47 on a Thursday night, about the ambulance bay doors opening, about the automatic decision to move rather than hesitate. She had not been thinking about justice. She had not been thinking about 6 years of erasure or classified programs or a senator in McLean, Virginia. She had been thinking about a man bleeding on her floor. That was the truth of it. And it was also, she thought, the point. The afternoon carried its own momentum. At 3:15, a federal press conference was held in Washington. It was conducted jointly by the DOJ and the DIA, and Deputy Director Holst spoke for 11 minutes about the Meridian program, the redirection, the 6 years of operational cover, and the arrest of Senator Gerald Prentice. She named the charges. She described the evidence. She named, with the permission of all involved, the 5 Meridian personnel whose records had been suppressed, and she described the restoration of those records as a matter of official record and official acknowledgement. She used the phrase a profound institutional failure, and she used it without the defensive hedging that government officials typically attach to phrases that acknowledge wrongdoing. Nora watched it in the third-floor conference room on Taft's laptop, sitting next to Marsh and across from Suarez. And she watched the press conference with the particular attention of someone who is accustomed to reading what isn't being said as closely as what is. What Holst wasn't saying. That this had been contained, that systems had worked, that the institution had caught it. What she was saying, in the space between the official language, that it had taken 6 years and 5 people's professional lives, and a gunshot wound, and a nurse in Hargrove, Colorado, and a document hidden in 3 different locations over 8 months. That was honest. Nora appreciated honest more than she appreciated managed. At 4 o'clock, Senator Prentice was transferred from the initial federal holding location to a federal detention facility in Virginia pending his bail hearing, which had been scheduled for the following morning. His attorney had released a third statement, shorter than the first 2 and considerably less specific, which suggested that the legal strategy was being recalibrated in light of the afternoon's developments. At 4:32, the bail hearing was moved to 2 days hence because the evidentiary package submitted by DOJ had expanded significantly enough that the court required additional time to review it. At 5 o'clock, 3 of Prentice's senior staffers from the Oversight Committee were contacted by federal investigators for voluntary interviews. One agreed immediately. One's attorney requested a 48-hour delay. The third retained counsel within 30 minutes of the contact and made no further statement. The network was not collapsing so much as it was being dismantled, piece by piece, with the deliberate procedural thoroughness of people who understood that a case of this complexity needed to be built carefully rather than quickly, and who had enough documentation to build it either way. Nora tracked the afternoon's movements from the hospital because she was still in the hospital, because there had not been a moment that felt like the appropriate moment to go home, and because she was not entirely sure, if she went home, what she would do there. Sandra found her at 5:15, which was the end of Sandra's shift, and Sandra was wearing her coat and carrying her bag, and had the look of someone who was leaving but had one more thing to say before leaving. "Go home," Sandra said. "I was thinking, I know what you were thinking. You were thinking that if you stay here, you're still in it, and if you go home, it becomes something that happened, and now you have to figure out what comes next." Sandra looked at her steadily. "The second one is harder, but it's where you actually are." Nora stood there. "The notebook," Sandra said. "The declaration you made this morning before you went into Drummond's office. I've put it in my personal files, like I said. It's yours whenever you want it." She paused. "For what it's worth, and I know this is insufficient, watching you work in this ER for 2 years has been one of the better parts of this job. I didn't know why, entirely, until today, but the why doesn't change the what." Nora looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for opening the door last night." "Which door?" "The notebook, the phone call to Denise, the coffee." She paused. "All of it." Sandra picked up her bag. "You're going to be fine," she said. "Not today, but eventually." She left. Nora stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she went to get her coat. She drove home through the late afternoon light that Hargrove got in the fall, the kind of light that hits the mountains at a low angle and makes everything look like it was designed to be looked at. And she thought about nothing in particular for approximately 4 minutes, which was the longest she'd managed it in about 18 hours. Her apartment was cold. She'd left the heat at the overnight setting, and the overnight setting, when you'd been gone since yesterday afternoon, was insufficient. She turned it up and stood in the kitchen and looked at the coffee maker and decided against it because it was 5:30 and she needed to actually sleep tonight. She sat down on the couch. Her phone had 47 notifications. She looked at the number and put the phone face down on the cushion beside her. She sat there in the cooling apartment that was starting to warm, in the quiet that felt enormous after the noise of the last 18 hours. And she let herself be still for the first time since 11:47 the previous night. The things she felt were not organized. Exhaustion was the loudest, but not the only thing. There was something adjacent to relief that hadn't fully resolved into relief yet, the way a system under pressure takes time to decompress even after the pressure source is removed. There was something that felt like anger, not acute, not directed, but present. The deep, slow burn of 2 years of being treated as interchangeable, and the 6 years before that of having her existence officially erased, and the understanding that those two things were connected. There was also something else, quieter than the rest. She had walked into that ER on a Thursday night, and she had done the thing she was trained to do. And that decision, that ordinary professional decision, the same kind she'd made 100 times in 2 years, had pulled a thread that had unraveled something that was supposed to stay buried forever. She had not done it because she was brave. She had done it because a person was bleeding. But that was the thing about buried things. They don't actually stay buried. They stay present, under the surface, and they exert pressure on everything above them. And sometimes the only thing standing between the buried thing and the light is one person in the right place making the right ordinary decision without fully understanding what it will open. She thought about that. She thought about the 4 other people from the program. Vega in his recovery bed, Bodkin in Arizona with 2 years of underbid contracts, the 2 others being contacted now, the one who hadn't lived to see this morning. She thought about what it costs to carry real capability in a world that has decided to pretend you don't have it. She thought about the ER downstairs, about Foley saying the compression technique with the weight of someone whose picture had just reorganized itself, about Drummond and his spreadsheet that he'd looked at this morning for what might have been the first time. The phone buzzed. She looked at it. Marsh. Bail denied. Prentice remanded to federal custody pending trial. Hearing lasted 18 minutes. She read it twice. Then she put the phone down and sat with it, with the specific, complicated texture of a thing being over and also not being over, because trials took time and accountability took time, and the full dismantling of a 6-year network was not going to be accomplished in one Thursday night, no matter how much pressure had been applied. But Prentice was in a federal facility tonight. Not in McLean, not in his Senate office, not on a news program discussing intelligence oversight with the practiced ease of someone who believed himself permanently insulated from consequence. That was real. That was something she had contributed to making real, from the position of a nurse in a county ER who was not supposed to be able to do anything about it. She lay down on the couch without intending to and was asleep in 4 minutes. But she slept for 11 hours, which was not something she had done since before she entered the program the first time, and she woke at 4:30 in the morning to a phone with 63 notifications and the particular clarity of a mind that had been given enough rest to actually function. She made coffee. She sat at her kitchen table and went through the notifications methodically, the way she went through anything, not by urgency but by relevance, separating what required response from what required reading from what required nothing at all. The relevant items were these: 3 messages from Marsh with updates on the Whitmore processing and the expansion of the evidentiary package to include the Northern Virginia employment connection. 1 message from Holst's office requesting her availability for a formal deposition scheduled for 2 days hence. 1 message from Taft confirming that the IG's financial investigation had identified 2 additional accounts connected to the Meridian redirection that were now part of the asset freeze proceedings against Prentice. 1 message from Renata Phelps, the correspondent, which said simply, "Whenever you're ready, no rush. This story will still be here." And 1 message from a number she didn't recognize, which turned out to be Ray Bodkin, the Meridian colleague in Arizona, which said, "Callahan, I heard what you did. Thank you. Bodkin." She sat with that one for a moment. Then she wrote back, "How are you doing?" He replied in 3 minutes, which meant he was also up at 4:30, which meant he was also someone who woke early and ran the day from the front rather than the back. He said, "Better than yesterday. Still working it out." She said, "Yeah." He said, "You think it actually sticks, the charges?" She thought about the document with the original signatures, about the financial trail that had been building for 14 months independent of everything else, about the secondary witness in Denver who had cooperated fully, about 6 people taken into custody in a hospital corridor who had been processing plea agreements since the previous afternoon, because federal conspiracy charges in a case with this much documentation tended to produce cooperative behavior at a significant rate. She said, "It sticks." A pause. Then, "Okay, that was all." But it was enough. The deposition took 4 hours over 2 days. Nora was thorough. She had the kind of memory for operational details that the program had trained in her, specific, sequential, resistant to the compressive editing that most people's memories perform on difficult material. And she used it without editing, because editing was someone else's job, and her job in that room was accuracy. Suarez asked the questions. A court reporter transcribed. Holst was present for part of the first session and absent for the second, which meant the second session covered material that Holst's oversight role required her to be distanced from. On the second day, Suarez asked her about the moment in the supply room, the night of the original incident, the 2 men who had come through the door. She described it. "Were you afraid?" he asked. She thought about this. "Yes," she said. "But you engaged anyway." "Being afraid and being functional aren't mutually exclusive," she said. "Anyone who tells you otherwise hasn't been in many genuinely dangerous situations." Suarez wrote something down. After the second session, walking out of the federal building where the depositions had been held, she stood on the steps in the early afternoon sun and thought about 2 years of being told, not always in words, sometimes just in the texture of how she was treated, that she was not quite enough. Not quite worth the attention, not quite worth the senior case assignments, not quite worth the assumption of competence that some of her colleagues received without having to demonstrate it first. The assumption of competence. That was the thing. The thing that some people walked through the world with and others had to earn constantly, from every new person in every new room, until the earning itself became invisible because it had to be. She had been earning it for 2 years in that ER, and for 4 years before that in a program that would officially not acknowledge it happened. And for the 6 years in between when the documentation of the earning had been removed from the system entirely, what she knew, Standing on those steps in the afternoon sun, with a federal deposition behind her and 47 cameras waiting somewhere to photograph her next public statement, was that the earning had happened regardless of whether anyone had been watching. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the whole thing. No. 3 weeks later, Prentice's bail hearing produced the expected result. Bail was set at a figure that was technically permissible and practically academic, given that the asset freeze proceedings had already restricted access to the financial instruments that would have been used to meet it. He remained in federal custody. His chief of staff, a man named Oliver Reardon, who had been with him for 11 years, accepted a cooperation agreement in exchange for testimony and a reduced charge profile. Reardon's testimony added 2 additional names to the conspiracy indictment, contractors who had been present at the Meridian redirection meeting and who had been operating inside the private network ever since. Both were arrested within a week of the indictment expansion. The 6 people taken from the hospital, the assault team, entered guilty pleas at a rate that Suarez described to Nora in one of their periodic update calls as efficient, which was Suarez's version of saying that the evidence against them was so complete that the calculation was obvious. Whitmore, facing the coordinated obstruction charge, eventually agreed to a cooperation arrangement that filled in several gaps in the timeline of how the hospital placement had been arranged. The Northern Virginia firm had been a front for 3 years. She had taken the Hargrove position specifically. She had been told it was low risk and long term, which was true until it wasn't. The plea included a minimum of 7 years. Bodkin, in Arizona, formally submitted his account to the federal record and received, the same week as Nora, the same document she had received: the restoration of his full-service history, the formal acknowledgement that the erasure had occurred through deliberate, unauthorized action, the official apology that used the specific language of institutional accountability rather than the softer language of institutional regret. He called her when he got it. "You read the whole thing?" he asked. "Yeah," she said. "Does it feel like enough?" She thought about that honestly. "No," she said, "but it's the right thing. And those are different questions." A pause. "Yeah," he said. "That's what I thought too." The interview with Renata Phelps happened 6 weeks after the night in the hospital. Nora had thought about what she wanted to say for those 6 weeks, not preparing a statement, not drafting answers, but thinking about what was actually true and what was worth saying and where the line between those 2 things ran. They met in person. A conference room at the correspondent's local affiliate, which was neutral ground. Phelps was thorough and fair. She asked hard questions without loading them, which was rarer than it should have been. She asked about the 2 years in the ER, about the 6 years before, about the night in the hospital, about what it felt like to have your professional history made to not exist. Nora answered what she could answer and declined what she couldn't, and she did both with the same directness. At the end, Phelps asked, "What do you want people to take from this?" Nora sat with it. "That the work doesn't stop mattering because nobody's watching it," she said. "I was a good nurse for 2 years in an ER where most of the senior people had decided I wasn't worth paying attention to. That was true whether or not anyone knew why. The capability was there before the recognition, and it was going to be there after the recognition, and it has nothing to do with whether the recognition comes." She paused. "People spend a lot of time waiting to be seen before they let themselves be what they are. That's the wrong order." Phelps wrote it down. The interview ran on a Tuesday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon it had been shared widely enough that Sandra Toll texted her a screenshot without comment, which was Sandra's version of saying she'd seen it and thought it was right. The new role came from Holst, 2 months after the night in the hospital. The offer was specific and structured, a joint position split between the DIA and a federal emergency medicine training program, developing integrated trauma protocols for military and civilian first responders. The work would involve the kind of field compression techniques that had never made it into any civilian manual, and the kind of operational medical knowledge that had been living in the classified world, serving the classified world, while civilian ER nurses dealt with the same categories of injury with a fraction of the applicable knowledge. Nora read the offer letter at her kitchen table in the early morning, with her coffee going cold beside her. She had not been looking for a new role. She had, if anything, been uncertain about whether she wanted to keep working in the ER at Hargrove, which had become in some ways the same place it had always been. The morning rhythms, the triage board, the specific smell of antiseptic and old coffee. And in other ways, completely different, because the people in it were different in how they saw her. And being seen accurately after 2 years of being seen incorrectly was its own complicated adjustment. The offer letter described the work in terms that she recognized as meaningful. She thought about the 4 people who had served in the program, whose knowledge had spent years being officially invisible. She thought about the things she knew how to do that no one had let her teach. She thought about Foley standing beside her at the nurse's station, saying the compression technique with the weight of genuine discovery. There was a generation of nurses who had never been given access to what she knew. There were emergency protocols that were unnecessarily limited because the people building them had never sat in a room with someone who'd learned medicine in the same environments that created the injuries civilian ERs now routinely treated. She picked up her pen. She signed the letter. Mom. Her last shift at Hargrove County General was a Thursday evening. She had requested Thursdays specifically when she'd scheduled the transition, because Thursdays were the rhythm she understood, and she wanted to end in a rhythm she understood rather than in ceremony. Drummond had offered a formal send-off, which she had declined. The board had offered a reception, which she had also declined. Sandra had looked at her when she declined the reception with the expression of someone who fully understood and was also mildly exasperated. You couldn't let them do one thing, Sandra had said. The naming of the trauma suite is one thing, Nora had said. That's sufficient. The shift was busy in the way Thursday evenings are busy. The rhythm that she had learned to read, the surge around 9, the particular Tuesday of the week chaos that Thursday night ER nursing generates. She treated a broken radius from a climbing accident, a pediatric asthma case that required more attention than the initial presentation suggested, and 2 separate lacerations from a kitchen incident involving a mandolin slicer that had, in her professional judgment, been used with insufficient caution. Between the lacerations and a hypertensive crisis in Bay 3, Foley found her at the medication station and said, in the slightly formal way he'd adopted since the night with Vega, as if he'd recalibrated the appropriate register for speaking to her and hadn't fully settled on the right one yet. Is it true you're leaving after tonight? Yes. The new program? Yes. He was quiet for a moment, working through something. Then, the stuff you know, the techniques, that's going to be, that information is going to actually reach people now. That's the idea. Good. He looked at his tablet, then back at her. I've been thinking about what you said that day in the lobby, about the work mattering before the recognition. He paused. I've been in medicine for 6 years and I think I've been doing it wrong. She looked at him. Not clinically, he said quickly, just the way I've been thinking about what it's for, what it means. He stopped. I'm not saying this well. You're saying it fine, she said. I just think you're better at knowing what it's for than most people I've trained under. And I wanted to say that before you go, in case it matters. It mattered. She didn't say so because the saying of it would have been more than the moment needed, but she looked at him and let it matter. She finished the shift at 2 a.m. and removed her badge at the nurse's station for the last time. And Sandra was there because Sandra was always there, and Nora had stopped being surprised by it. And Sandra took the badge without ceremony and put it in the desk drawer. You're going to be good at the new thing, Sandra said. I was good at this thing, Nora said. You were excellent at this thing, Sandra said. And you'll be excellent at the next thing. That's just what you are. She paused. Some people have to figure out what they're for. You've always known. You just had to get back to the circumstances where it could be fully used. Nora stood at the nurse's station for a moment, looking at the ER, the triage board with its color-coded status markers, the bays with their curtains, the monitors cycling through their metrics, the ordinary machinery of keeping people alive running on its own rhythm, regardless of anything else. She had kept people alive here, hundreds of times, in large ways and small ways, in ways the chart noted, in ways the chart didn't capture. She had done it without recognition and without credential for 2 years, and it had counted the same way regardless. That was the thing she needed to carry forward, more than the record restoration, more than the federal deposition, more than the name trauma suite. The work had been real before anyone acknowledged it. That meant the acknowledgement was the smaller thing. She walked out through the ER entrance for the last time, into the dark of a Thursday night that had gotten cold and sharp while she'd been inside. And the parking lot was ordinary, and the streetlights were ordinary, and the mountains in the distance were indistinct against the darker dark of the sky. She stood there for a moment. Then she got in her car and drove home, and behind her the ER kept running. And in a federal detention facility in Virginia, a man who had spent 6 years constructing a world where people like her didn't officially exist was sleeping in a room he hadn't chosen. And in a hospital room 4 floors up from the ER, a recovery chart, with Thomas Vega's name on it, was being updated by a night nurse making accurate notes about a man who had spent 8 months in motion and was finally being allowed to stop. And somewhere in Arizona, Ray Bodkin was probably awake at an hour that was too early for most people, running the same discipline that they'd all been taught, carrying the restored weight of a history that was his again. She drove through the sleeping streets of Hargrove and thought about what it had cost, all of it, and decided that the accounting was not something she could complete yet, because some costs only became clear in retrospect, and she was still in the forward motion of it. What she knew, cleanly and without qualification, was this. She had not been diminished by the erasure, even when it had felt like she had. She had not become less capable because no record said she was capable. She had not become smaller because the people around her couldn't see the full size of what she was. The work had always been there, below the surface, exerting pressure upward. And eventually, not in the way she'd planned, not without cost, not cleanly or perfectly or on anyone's convenient timeline, it had broken through. She had broken through. Not because she'd announced herself, not because she'd insisted on being seen, but because when the moment arrived, she had simply done the thing she was trained to do, without hesitation, without waiting for permission. That was the lesson. Not the senator in custody, not the restored record, not the cameras on the hospital steps. The lesson was, you don't become what you are when people recognize it. You already are it. The recognition is just the world catching up. She pulled into her parking space and turned off the engine and sat in the quiet for a moment. Then she went inside, made tea instead of coffee, and started reading the briefing materials for the new job.